Hello fellow Sapiens, and welcome to Sleepless Homo. This is slow storytelling for tired humans, whether you're preparing to sleep, cooking, working, or just letting a calm voice keep you company. If you find value here, a like and subscribe helps more people discover long-form science told softly, knowledge to outlast noise. Share in the comments. Do you use this while falling asleep or while focused on tasks? Or maybe tell me where you're listening from. And if you happen to drift off mid-chapter, there are timestamps below so you can return the next day. The whole story is worth hearing. This is a channel for soft science, not wild speculation. We don't have all the answers, but we tell the evidence as humbly as we can. And as always, stay curious, stay calm. Now let's ask, why didn't we go extinct 10 million years ago? Now let us step back into the world that came long before us, when apes ruled in a way that feels almost impossible today. Did the world almost belong to them long before humans ever arrived? Between 20 million and 10 million years ago, during what scientists call the Miocene epoch, the Earth hosted a richness of ape life that dwarfs the fragile handful of species we see today. Fossils from Africa, Europe and Asia show us a planet alive with primates that filled every corner of the warm forests and wetlands. Some climbed through the canopy, some stalked the understory, and others tested new ways of moving and eating. In this age, the Great Ape family exploded in number and variety, not through one path, but through many simultaneous experiments in survival. The Miocene was not a single scene frozen in time. It stretched over 10 million years, a span so long that entire mountain ranges shifted, seas rose and fell, and forests expanded over continents before retreating again. At its start, around 20 million years ago, Africa was still a continent slightly isolated, holding forests dense with early primates who had only recently diverged from their monkey-like ancestors. In this lush beginning, species such as Proconsul found a foothold. They were not quite like today's apes, but they were not monkeys either. Their bodies lacked tails, their arms and legs hinted at a different future, and they filled the branches with an agility suited for a forested earth. As the Miocene progressed, something extraordinary happened. Apes spread out of Africa into Eurasia, and with each new region they entered, they adapted in ways that left behind fossils that look more like characters in a branching evolutionary story than any single straight line. In the European record, Dryopithecus swung among the trees with a shoulder more mobile than those of earlier apes, hinting at movements that we still recognise in the brachiating swings of gibbons today. In Asia, Oreopithecus appeared with facial features that strangely echo modern orangutans, though separated by millions of years. In Africa itself, forms like Afropithecus thrived, each with their own specializations in jaw shape, tooth wear, or skeletal adaptations. What made this time so unusual was the sheer scale of ape diversity. By the middle of the Miocene, scientists estimate that as many as 100 distinct species of apes existed, spread across 3 continents. They were not copies of each other, but a kaleidoscope of primates exploring different ecological opportunities. Some remained small, weighing just a few kilograms, leaping quickly from branch to branch and eating softer fruits. Others grew heavier, perhaps over 50 kilograms, able to break open tougher plant material or claim larger feeding ranges. It was, in every sense, a planet of the apes. To imagine what such a world felt like requires letting go of the narrow lens of today's forests. Now, in the 21st century, apes are rare, often endangered, and confined to small, fragile habitats in Africa and Southeast Asia. But in the Miocene, forests were vast. The world was warmer than today, sea levels higher, and tropical and subtropical greenery stretched into regions where now we find temperate woodlands or dry grasslands. For apes, this was an invitation. They diversified not because they had to cling on, but because the environment offered countless new niches. This is what evolutionary biologists call adaptive radiation, a moment when opportunity outweighs constraint. Much as Darwin later noticed among the finches of the Galapagos Islands, small differences in beak or jaw or body size allowed species to occupy different feeding zones and survive side by side without driving each other out. Fossil evidence suggests that in the dense forests of Europe, Dryopithecus may have eaten fruits and softer leaves, while in more open woodlands of East Africa, species like Gigantopithecus developed thicker enamel suited for harder, more abrasive foods. Meanwhile in Asia, forms like Sivapithecus experimented with other diets, perhaps relying more heavily on certain seasonal fruits or even tough seeds. These subtle variations tell us that coexistence was possible, not because all apes were the same, but because each carved out a slightly different way of life. This flourishing, however, carried within it a quiet risk. The very reason apes thrived, abundant forests, was also a delicate foundation. Environments change, climate shifts. Forests can recede as quickly as they expand, leaving specialists vulnerable. When we look back at this golden age, we cannot avoid the realization that much of it has been erased. The 100 species of Miocene apes left behind only fragments of teeth, jaws, and bones in scattered deposits. Each fossil is a reminder of a vanished form, an evolutionary experiment that did not last. The question that lingers, then, is why? If apes were once so widespread, what made their glory temporary? Scientists studying the Miocene have pieced together a picture of a world in transition. Around 15 million years ago, the Earth began to cool gradually after a warm phase known as the Miocene climatic optimum. Ice sheets reappeared at the poles, rainfall patterns shifted, and regions that had been blanketed in forest began to fragment into mixed woodlands and open areas. For species tied to the canopy, this spelled trouble. Some adapted, many did not. Still, during the window from 20 to 10 million years ago, before those shifts fully closed in, the Earth belonged to apes in a way that feels almost mythological today. Imagine standing in a Miocene forest in what is now Central Europe. Above you, the branches shake with the movements of Dryopithecus. Around you, smaller primates dart and leap. In the distance, perhaps a heavier form rustles through leaves, its jaws built for something tougher. This was not a forest ruled by one lineage, but a community of dozens. In Africa, the story played out differently, but with similar richness. Fossils from sites in Kenya and Uganda tell us of proconsul, Afropithecus, and Kenyapithecus, each representing different steps along the path of ape diversification. Some had elongated faces and powerful jaws suited for crushing, while others carried skeletal hints of postures that would allow more upright movement. Again, not a straight road, but a thicket of paths, most of which ended long ago. Asia contributed its own caste. The Indian subcontinent was home to Sivapithecus, and in parts of China other lesser-known genera left their traces. Each continent, in its own way, hosted the experiments of evolution, producing a mosaic of apes that together formed a global dynasty. When we consider this golden age, it is tempting to view it as a precursor to humanity, as if all these species were rehearsals leading to us. But science resists such simplicity. Most of these apes were not our ancestors. They were cousins, distant branches that thrived in their own right. They remind us that evolution is not progress toward a predetermined goal, but a process of variation and survival in the moment. If conditions had remained stable, perhaps many of them would still be here. The haunting reflection is that extinction is as natural as diversification. For every flourishing, there is a fading. Apes nearly conquered the warm forests of the Miocene, but their numbers and forms dwindled when climates turned. We are left to ask, if diversity could be so rich then and so reduced now, what does that mean for the apes who still live among us? And more unsettling still, what does it mean for us, who carry their legacy in our own fragile survival? The Miocene reminds us that life on Earth is not a steady climb, but a shifting stage. 10 million years ago, apes filled the world. Today, we are their last representatives, clinging to the branches of a family tree that once spread in every direction. The Golden Age was real. It belonged to them. But nothing in evolution lasts forever. To look deeper at this flourishing, we also have to pay attention to the landscapes themselves, because the Miocene was not just about apes suddenly appearing everywhere, but about continents moving and ecosystems reshaping in ways that opened new doors. During this epoch, the collision of Africa with Eurasia closed the Great Tethys Sea and created land bridges that allowed primates to spread farther than they ever had before. What had once been separate evolutionary arenas slowly merged, letting African apes colonize Europe and Asia. Each migration meant new diets, new predators, and new challenges. Some species developed thicker enamel, others changed their chewing muscles, still others shifted their shoulder joints for different styles of climbing. The fact that we see ape fossils from Spain to India during this window is evidence of a world in motion, a time when dispersal and adaptation went hand in hand. Fossilised pollen and plant remains also reveal the story of the Miocene as one of botanical change. Expansive forests of oak, maple and other broad-leaved trees spread northward into what are now cooler latitudes, offering apes resources in places that feel unimaginable today. Picture Germany with dense subtropical forest canopies, or the Mediterranean basin without its present-day aridity, but instead draped in green. Apes thrived in these settings not because they conquered the world by force, but because the world itself gave them opportunities. In that sense, their golden age was not built on dominance but on circumstance. It is also worth remembering that apes were not alone in this flourishing. Alongside them lived an array of other mammals, early elephants with shorter trunks, primitive horses no larger than ponies, antelope relatives finding their footing in the open woodlands, and predators that hunted among the shadows. The Miocene forests were not silent laboratories, but living, noisy ecosystems where every branch held a contest between survival and failure. That apes found so many ways to coexist with these shifting castmates shows how dynamic the period truly was. And yet, the very success of Miocene apes makes the present feel uncanny. Out of nearly 100 species that filled Earth's warm forests between 20 and 10 million years ago, only a handful of great ape lineages remain today, and all of them are vulnerable. The contrast raises a sobering question. Was their golden age an accident of climate that could never last? Or do we live in a diminished aftermath where we happen to be the last custodians of that once bursting tree? Looking back at the Miocene, we see not inevitability, but fragility. The diversity of apes then reminds us that Earth can host worlds entirely different from the one we know now, full of forms that seem improbable until their bones are found in ancient sediments. They remind us that for a time, the planet did almost belong to them, and that their story could have continued in countless directions. We live in only one of those possible outcomes, and that realization is as humbling as it is unsettling. What kind of world allows apes to flourish by the dozens? To answer this, we need to walk into the Earth of 20 to 15 million years ago, a time when the planet's face was draped in green, when oceans lapped higher on the continents, and when forests seemed to stretch without limit. It was the height of what geologists call the Miocene climatic optimum, a period when the Earth was several degrees warmer than it is today, and when the great forests expanded northward and southward to embrace much larger swathes of the continents. In this warmth, apes found a cradle. Not just one kind, not just a few, but dozens upon dozens of different forms, each testing its own survival strategy in an environment that seemed almost endlessly generous. If you could step into those forests, you would be struck by their density and by their scale. Vast stands of evergreen trees mixed with broad-leaved deciduous giants, stretching high into a humid sky. Underneath grew layers of shrubs and vines, producing a complex vertical world with food sources at every level. In places that are now temperate or even arid, the climate was then subtropical, filled with cicadas buzzing and primates moving across the canopy. Germany, France, and even parts of Britain were cloaked in woodlands, more reminiscent of equatorial Africa. Asia too, from India to China, held sprawling forests that reached across entire regions. And in Africa, still the heartland of primate evolution, woodland supported a wide range of early apes, some of which had already begun to experiment with new body forms and diets. It is within this world of seemingly endless forests that apes radiated into extraordinary diversity. Biologists call this process adaptive radiation, the rapid branching of a lineage into many forms when ecological opportunity presents itself. In the oceans, we see it in the Cambrian explosion of marine invertebrates. On islands, we see it in Darwin's finches and in Hawaiian honeycreepers. And in the Miocene forests, we see it in apes. The reason is simple. A warm, wet, forested earth created niches in abundance. Fruits ripened at different times. Leaves presented varying levels of toughness. Insects buzzed in layers of the canopy, and water-rich plants grew in shaded understories. For a lineage already specialised in climbing, grasping, and social living, this was a canvas waiting to be painted with diversity. Proconsul is often placed at the beginning of this flourishing, a primate that lived in Africa during the early Miocene. Fossils found in Kenya show a creature without a tail, with a mix of monkey-like and ape-like traits. Proconsul did not yet swing below branches in the way modern gibbons or chimpanzees might, but it marked the first steps into a distinctly ape-like body plan. Its hands and feet suggest a reliance on climbing, while its dentition shows a diet that likely included both fruits and leaves. What makes Proconsul fascinating is not that it looked like us, but that it demonstrates how apes were beginning to carve out a unique way of living in forests that rewarded versatility. As the forests continued to expand during the warmest stretches of the Miocene, new apes appeared across Africa and into Eurasia. In Europe, the genus Dryopithecus emerged, leaving behind fossils in what are now Spain, France, and Hungary. Dryopithecus carried adaptations in the shoulder and arm that hint at suspensory locomotion, the kind of hanging and swinging we associate with later apes. Its teeth suggest a fruit-heavy diet, fitting for the lush forests of Europe at the time. Meanwhile, in Africa, Afropithecus evolved with a more projecting face and jaws suited for tougher vegetation. Each form was not a step along a single road, but a separate experiment in how to live in a forested earth that offered many ways to make a living. The richness of Miocene ape life was not limited to differences in diet or locomotion. Body size varied widely, from small, lightly built apes weighing just a few kilograms to larger species that reached the mass of a modern chimpanzee or more. This variation allowed species to occupy different vertical zones in the forest. Smaller apes could move quickly in the upper branches, chasing insects or plucking fruits that grew at the tips of fine branches. Larger apes could dominate lower canopies, breaking sturdier branches and consuming tougher foods. In essence, the forest acted as a layered habitat, and apes took advantage of every level. What is striking in the fossil record of 20 to 15 million years ago is how widespread apes became. Their fossils are not confined to one continent or one corner of the tropics. From Kenya and Uganda to Spain and France to sites in Asia, apes appear again and again in sediments of this age. They were not marginal players, but dominant mammals of their environments. They lived alongside early elephants, primitive horses, and ancient relatives of antelopes, and yet they held their ground, finding ways to thrive in forests that provided food and cover in abundance. It is worth pausing here to think about the scale of this expansion. Imagine Europe not as a land of grasslands and temperate forests, but as a humid expanse where apes could thrive. Imagine Asia's landscapes not as the mix we know today, but as broad subtropical forests that stretched for hundreds of kilometres. In this world, apes did not just survive, they experimented, producing an evolutionary variety unmatched at any other time in their history. And yet, as scientists pieced together from fossil sites, this golden world of endless forests was delicate. The very conditions that made apes so diverse, warmth, moisture, and forest spread, were conditions that could change. But for those millions of years when the canopy seemed boundless, apes were the beneficiaries. The question that echoes across time is whether such richness was sustainable, or whether it was always a temporary bloom destined to contract. When we look at the Miocene of 20 to 15 million years ago, we see a world that answered the hook directly. It was a climate of warmth, seas that swelled over coastlines, forests that expanded into regions far beyond the tropics, and a diversity of ecological niches that invited apes to flourish. They did not dominate the earth through conquest, but through adaptation to a world that seemed, for a time, limitless. The haunting reflection is that such lushness has never returned on the same scale. The earth of today cannot host that same variety of apes, no matter how much we might wish it. Their golden forests are gone, leaving us only fragments in the fossil record and the reminder that abundance is never guaranteed. Why did apes evolve into so many shapes and lifestyles? Between 15 and 12 million years ago, the Earth staged one of the richest evolutionary spectacles in primate history. This was not a world of a single kind of ape, nor even a handful, but a teeming carnival of forms. If we think of the Miocene as the golden age of apes, then this period was its parade, noisy, varied, and filled with experiments in how to live, feed, and move in a forested planet. The fossil record tells us that dozens of different genera thrived across Africa, Europe, and Asia. Some leapt through branches light as dancers, Others moved deliberately with the weight of browsers, and some even adapted to swampy environments that most mammals would have avoided. To understand why, we need to look at how ecosystems shape variety, and how apes, like other animals before and after them, partitioned the world into niches where each could find room. To appreciate the richness of this period, it helps to think about ecological partitioning. In modern African savannas, zebras, antelope, giraffes, and gazelles can all graze in the same region because each eats different plants or feeds at different heights. The same principle seems to have operated in Miocene forests. One ape lineage specialized in fruiting trees, another in harder seeds, another in leaves from the understory, and still another in swamp vegetation. This partitioning reduced competition, making it possible for many species to coexist. Without it, the carnival would have collapsed into conflict, but with it, variety flourished. The fossils we find across continents reinforce this pattern. In Hungary, Dryopithecus remains show evidence of a fruit-heavy diet, perfectly suited to Europe's warm forests. In Anatolia, Gigantopithecus left behind jaws with thick enamel, suggesting it could exploit harder foods. In Kenya, Afropithecus revealed long faces and jaws robust enough for fibrous plants, while still agile enough to climb. In each case, subtle differences in anatomy correspond to different ecological roles. It is as if the Miocene forests were vast stages and the apes were actors, each rehearsing a different role. Some took to the treetops, others stayed lower, and a few even tested the waters of swamps and wetlands. The Middle Miocene brought a maturity to the ape lineage that earlier periods had only hinted at. In Africa, Proconsul and its kin had laid the foundation for ape-like bodies without tails and with strong grasping limbs. But by 15 million years ago, a broader range of forms had emerged. In East Africa, fossils of Gigantopithecus suggest a sturdier, more terrestrial animal, one that did not spend all of its life clinging to branches. The robust jaws and thick enamel teeth of Gigantopithecus hint at a diet that included tougher foods than those of its predecessors. This was a primate beginning to test life on the ground, not abandoning the forest, but exploring new levels of it. Its existence shows that apes were no longer bound to one strategy. In Europe, meanwhile, Dryopithecus filled a different role. Its long arms and flexible shoulders suggest a suspensory way of moving beneath branches, an acrobat of the canopy. Its teeth tell us that fruits were its mainstay, a diet matched perfectly to the lush forest that then covered parts of Spain, France, and Central Europe. Dryopithecus demonstrates another branch of the carnival, a specialist in soft seasonal foods that required agility and reach. Side by side with Gigantopithecus, it illustrates how the same family could generate very different solutions in different regions. Asia, too, added its own performers to the parade. Oreopithecus, whose fossils are found in India and Pakistan, bore a striking resemblance in its face to modern orangutans, with a concave profile and tall orbits. Yet its body proportions suggest it did not move in exactly the same way as its modern relatives. Oreopithecus may have lived a life somewhere between arboreal and terrestrial, combining fruit eating with other dietary options. It shows us how Asia's forests hosted their own experiments, parallel to but distinct from those in Europe and Africa. The oddities of this carnival are perhaps best illustrated by Oreopithecus, discovered in coal deposits in Italy. Although dating somewhat later, its ancestors arose in this mid-Miocene context of experimentation. Oreopithecus had unusual limb proportions, with features suggesting it may have been capable of walking upright at least occasionally. Its teeth, however, show adaptations for consuming foods found in swampy habitats, likely including water plants. Few apes ventured into such ecological extremes, but Oreopithecus reveals that when the Miocene offered wetlands and isolated islands of habitat, some apes accepted the challenge. The Middle Miocene carnival was not limited to diet and locomotion. Social behaviour, though harder to detect in fossils, likely varied as well. Differences in body size suggest differences in group dynamics. Smaller apes might have moved in larger troops, darting quickly and exploiting abundant foods. Larger-bodied apes likely required larger home ranges, and may have lived in smaller groups, investing in slower reproductive strategies. These differences further diversified how species could share space. In thinking about this carnival, it is important to resist seeing it as leading inevitably to us. None of these apes were on a straight path to becoming human. They were successful in their own right, filling environments that no longer exist today. Evolution does not plan ahead. It responds to opportunities. In the warm, expansive forests of 15 to 12 million years ago, the opportunities were abundant, and apes filled them in exuberant fashion. So why did apes evolve into so many shapes and lifestyles during this period? The answer lies in the combination of ecological richness, geographic spread, and evolutionary flexibility. The Earth itself was warmer, wetter, and greener. Forests stretched across continents, providing countless niches. Apes, with their grasping limbs, varied diets, and social complexity, were particularly well suited to diversify within them. And so they did, leaving behind a fossil record that looks less like a family tree and more like a tangle of vines, each twisting in its own direction. The Middle Miocene Carnival of Apes reminds us that life is not static but endlessly experimental. In those forests, the word ape could mean a suspensory fruit eater, a swamp specialist, a ground-walking browser, or something in between. Together they formed a mosaic of primate life that has never been repeated on the same scale. Today we see only the shadows of that diversity, but in their time they filled the world with variety. The lesson is that evolution's greatest creativity often appears not when one lineage dominates, but when many coexist, each finding its own way to live. The carnival was real, and it filled the forests of 15 to 12 million years ago with a richness we can scarcely imagine. To understand the depth of this carnival, it helps to widen the lens beyond the well-known names and pay attention to the quieter fossils, the ones that hint at creatures less celebrated, but equally vital in painting the picture. In East Africa, researchers have uncovered remains of Nutcracker, an ape that lived during this very interval and displayed a different suite of traits. Its arms and torso suggest careful climbing rather than the dramatic suspensory movement of Dryopithecus. Instead of specialising in aerial acrobatics, Nutcracker seems to have adopted a more measured, deliberate strategy, moving slowly through mid-level forest layers and taking advantage of foods less accessible to faster, more agile species. Its presence shows that even subtle differences in locomotion could carve out an ecological role in the crowded Miocene forest. Other discoveries highlight how apes spread into unexpected corners. In parts of Asia, Pleiobates, sometimes called lyre, after the remarkable fossil discovered in Spain but connected through comparative anatomy to broader Asian lineages, showed that small-bodied apes were not just minor players but successful participants in this carnival. Pleiobates was tiny compared with giants like Dryopithecus, but its anatomy suggests it was adept at moving in fine branch canopies, reaching fruits and insects in places too delicate for larger animals to navigate. This size-based partitioning reflects a principle still seen in modern ecosystems, where smaller primates exploit microhabitats unavailable to heavier relatives. The same period also saw hints of experimentation in diet beyond plant foods. Some toothwear patterns suggest that a few species may have added insects or even small vertebrates into their menu, not as primary resources but as supplements. If true, this broadens our image of Miocene apes from strict herbivores to opportunists, exploiting whatever their environment offered. That variety of strategies — fruit specialists, hard object feeders, swamp browsers, small-bodied insect hunters — made the forest not a place of competition alone, but of shared abundance. Even geography itself played a role in shaping diversity. During this time, tectonic shifts altered landscapes, creating pockets of isolation where populations could evolve independently. The collision of Africa with Eurasia not only opened migration routes, but also generated mountains, valleys, and inland seas. Each new barrier or corridor created opportunities for populations to separate, adapt, and diversify. The carnival was not only ecological but geographic, a shifting stage on which actors continually entered and exited. What is perhaps most humbling is how much of this story we know only through fragments: a partial jaw here, a handful of teeth there, a limb bone in a quarry wall. From these, paleontologists reconstruct entire ways of life, and though each fossil tells us something, the gaps between them remain vast. We may never know just how many ape species filled the forests between 15 and 12 million years ago. What we can say, based on what evidence survives, is that this was a time when the word ape carried a diversity of meanings unmatched before or since, a living carnival where evolution performed in every corner of the canopy. Why did some apes become enormous while others went small? Between 12 and 10 million years ago, the Miocene forests were still abundant, but within them apes began to explore two extremes of body size. In the fossil record, we see creatures weighing no more than a house cat alongside others that would have dwarfed the largest living gorilla. The emergence of these giants and miniatures was not random. It was the result of evolutionary trade-offs, the costs and benefits of being large or small in a world filled with shifting food supplies, predators, and opportunities. To walk through this period is to see nature experimenting with scale itself, testing whether survival was best served by bulk and strength or by agility and delicacy. The most famous of the giants is Gigantopithecus, known from scattered remains found in caves and in ancient sediments across southern China and parts of Southeast Asia. Though the fossil record is limited, mostly teeth and jaw fragments, the scale of these specimens is unmistakable. Gigantopithecus would have stood close to 3 meters tall and weighed as much as 300 kilograms, nearly twice the mass of modern gorillas. Its molars are massive, its jaws built to process extraordinary amounts of vegetation. While no complete skeleton has ever been found, reconstructions suggest a lumbering, heavy animal, likely spending more time on the ground than in the branches. It was not a delicate acrobat of the canopy, but a giant browser, stripping vegetation and consuming it in quantities few competitors could match. At the other end of the spectrum we find Simiolus, a tiny ape known from remains discovered in East Africa. Simiolus weighed perhaps 4 kilograms, smaller than many modern monkeys, with a body built for speed and maneuverability. Its delicate skeleton and dental patterns suggest a diet based on fruits and soft plant matter, foods available in the finer twigs and higher reaches of the forest canopy. Simiolus exemplifies the small-bodied strategy, access to resources that larger apes could not reach, rapid movement through dense vegetation, and reduced energy needs compared with the giants below. Why would evolution produce both extremes at the same time? The answer lies in the principle of trade-offs. Large size brings advantages. It deters predators, allows access to tougher and more fibrous foods, and provides strength to travel long distances in search of sustenance. But large size also carries costs, enormous caloric demands, slower reproduction, and limited agility in the treetops. Small size, on the other hand, requires far less food, allows exploitation of delicate branches, and enables faster maturity. But it comes with increased vulnerability to predators and fewer defences when resources run scarce. In the forests of 12 to 10 million years ago, both strategies could succeed depending on the local environment. Evidence from dental wear and isotopic analysis suggests that Gigantopithecus specialised heavily in certain plant foods. Its thick enamel molars and massive jaws imply a life of grinding vegetation day after day. Simiolus, by contrast, shows signs of a diet focused on fruits and perhaps small insects. These dietary differences mirror their ecological roles. Gigantopithecus was a bulk feeder, dominating large areas of forest understory, while Simiolus was a nimble forager, darting into places where bulkier species could not go. Each carved out its survival strategy, reducing direct competition and thriving in its own ecological space. This dichotomy of size also reflects a broader truth about Miocene environments. Forests were not uniform. Some regions offered dense canopies rich in fruit, while others contained more open woodlands with tougher vegetation. In Asia, large-bodied browsers like Gigantopithecus exploited extensive bamboo and fibrous plants. In Africa, small-bodied specialists like Simiolus thrived in fruiting canopies. The spread of apes into different continents and habitats encouraged experiments at every scale, from the tiny to the colossal. Beyond diet and habitat, body size also influenced social structure. Large apes often reproduce slowly, with long intervals between births, while small-bodied primates can produce offspring more frequently. This difference shapes population dynamics. Gigantopithecus would have had fewer young at any given time, investing heavily in each offspring. Simiolus, by contrast, may have reproduced more quickly, sustaining populations even in fluctuating environments. These demographic strategies mirror their ecological trade-offs. Giants relying on strength and endurance, miniatures on speed and numbers. What is humbling about this period is how incomplete our knowledge remains. For Gigantopithecus, we have no postcranial skeletons, no direct evidence of locomotion, only fragments of jaws and teeth. Yet from those fragments we infer size, diet, and lifestyle. For Simiolus, our fossils are more complete but still sparse, leaving room for debate about exactly how it lived. Science works with fragments, and each new discovery refines the picture but also reminds us of what we do not know. The carnival of apes between 12 and 10 million years ago included many forms, only a few of which have left us traces. Still, the pattern is clear. Evolution in this period was not about uniformity, but about pushing the boundaries of what an ape could be. Some species explored gigantism, others miniaturization, each with its own risks and rewards. In the forests of the Miocene, there was room for both. The haunting reflection is whether either strategy truly guaranteed long-term survival. Being huge gave strength, but also fragility. Being tiny allowed agility but offered little protection. Nature, it seems, was experimenting with the full range of possibilities, and the giants and miniatures of this age remind us that survival is never a single formula, but a shifting balance of trade-offs. The birth of giants, alongside the rise of miniatures, shows us that even within one family of primates, evolution can generate extremes. It is a reminder that the story of apes is not just about our own lineage, but about a diversity of bodies, diets, and lifestyles that once filled the forests of Earth. Today, only a narrow band of that variety remains, but in the Miocene the family tested every size imaginable. Whether towering over the forest floor or darting along the thinnest branches, apes found ways to live, each a different answer to the same question. How do you survive in a world of endless green? Another dimension of body size that shaped these Miocene apes was mobility. The giants, by sheer mass, would have been restricted to broad trunks and the forest floor where their weight could be supported. A body weighing hundreds of kilograms cannot balance easily on swaying branches, and so the larger apes must have developed foraging ranges that stretched horizontally across the land rather than vertically through the canopy. They likely walked deliberately, stripping large quantities of vegetation as they moved, much like modern gorillas do in Central Africa. The smallest apes, on the other hand, turned the vertical forest into a three-dimensional playground. Simiolus and similar species could dart across vines, leap between slender branches, and escape predators by vanishing into tangles where no large animal could follow. These opposing strategies created two entirely different experiences of the same forest, one slow and sweeping, the other nimble and intricate. Predators also played a role in shaping body size. Large apes, by virtue of their mass, were probably less vulnerable to mid-sized carnivores. Few predators would risk attacking a 300-kilogram ape with crushing jaws. The tiny apes, though, could never rely on size to deter threats. Their safety came from speed, agility, and perhaps from grouping in numbers that allowed many eyes to watch for danger. Each end of the size spectrum offered protection, though in opposite ways, one through intimidation, the other through elusiveness. Energy use adds another layer of complexity. A giant like Gigantopithecus would have required a constant intake of calories, forcing it into almost endless feeding. In ecological terms, it was locked into a strategy of bulk consumption. Smaller apes could survive on modest amounts of food, nibbling fruits, tender leaves, and insects without exhausting themselves. This difference meant that during periods of plenty, giants could dominate, but when resources dipped, small apes had the advantage. In this sense, the Miocene forests were arenas of shifting opportunity, rewarding one strategy in one season and another in the next. Even communication and social life may have been affected by body size. Larger apes could have relied on booming vocalizations that carried through the understory, warning rivals or maintaining contact with distant group members. Small apes, flitting in dense foliage, may have used higher-pitched calls, subtle gestures, or rapid signals that matched their quicker pace of life. Though evidence for this is indirect, drawn from comparison with living primates, it hints that the carnival of body sizes also meant a carnival of social sounds and interactions echoing across the Miocene world. All of this underscores a central point. The birth of giants and miniatures was not about one form being better than the other. It was about the forest offering so many niches that both extremes could coexist. The same environment that could support a slow-moving bulk feeder could also sustain a lightweight branch runner. Evolution, with no script to follow, tested both, and for millions of years both strategies worked. What happens when warm, endless forests begin to shrink? Between 10 and 8 million years ago, the Miocene world began to turn. The lush canopies that had stretched across continents during the height of the climatic optimum now faced the first serious contractions. The Earth cooled by a few degrees, not enough to freeze oceans or glaciers across the mid-latitudes, but enough to alter rainfall, dry soils, and open gaps in the forests that had once seemed infinite. This was the beginning of a long climatic trend, one that would reshape ecosystems, test evolutionary experiments, and quietly set the stage for a very different planet. For the apes who had filled those forests with their diversity, it was the start of a narrowing corridor. The fossil record tells us that by 10 million years ago, the golden abundance of apes was already under strain. Not because they suddenly became less suited to life, but because their environments were changing beneath them. Geochemical evidence from ocean sediments, particularly the oxygen isotopes preserved in the shells of tiny plankton, reveals a shift toward cooler and drier global conditions. Ice sheets at the poles began to expand, sea levels dropped, and atmospheric circulation altered rainfall patterns. What had once been stable humid zones became patchier, with dry seasons lengthening and evergreen forests breaking into mixed woodland and open savanna in many regions. For an ape lineage dependent on canopy food sources and dense arboreal cover, these subtle changes mattered. In Europe, this period saw a notable decline in ape diversity. Fossils from sites in Hungary, Spain, and France show that many of the species that had flourished in the earlier Miocene were no longer as abundant. Some persisted, like Dryopithecus, but their distribution became more limited. The dense fruit-rich forests that sustained them retreated, replaced in part by drier woodlands and grasslands, where hoofed mammals began to thrive. Antelopes, early bovids, and equids expanded their ranges, grazing in areas where forests once dominated. Apes, tied to fruits and leaves in high branches, could not easily follow into these new open habitats. In Africa, the picture is more complex. The continent remained a stronghold of ape diversity, but even there the signs of change are visible. Genera such as Gigantopithecus adapted to harder foods, as evidenced by their thick enamel, may have had a slight advantage in coping with more seasonal forests. Yet the long-term trend was unmistakable. The great continuous forests were fragmenting. Apes that had evolved for suspensory locomotion and soft fruit diets faced dwindling opportunities. Meanwhile, those capable of more versatile diets found temporary niches in the changing landscapes. Asia, too, bore witness to ecological shifts. Fossil evidence from Turkey, India, and China suggests that apes still persisted, but they did so in increasingly patchy habitats. Where once vast subtropical forests stretched unbroken, now mosaics of forest, woodland, and grassland appeared. The very success of apes in diversifying during the earlier Miocene became a vulnerability. Specializations that had worked well in stable, humid forests became less advantageous when the canopy thinned and food supplies grew more seasonal. The broader ecological story of this time is told not only in primate fossils, but also in the spread of grazing and browsing mammals. Herbivores that could exploit grasses and tougher shrubs began to increase in number. Horses evolved more durable teeth, antelopes radiated into new forms, and elephants expanded across continents. This was not a sudden takeover, but a gradual shift in which forests lost ground and grasslands advanced. The apes, once the dominant primates of dense forests, were now competing in a world where open landscapes supported entirely different communities. What makes this period so significant is not simply that climates changed. Climates are always shifting, but that the very fabric of the environments that had sustained apes was unravelling. The endless forests were no longer endless. For species that lived in the canopy, this meant increased travel between food patches, higher energy costs, and greater exposure to predators when moving across open ground. For fruit specialists, seasonal shortages became more severe, forcing some toward fallback foods they were less well equipped to process. For larger-bodied apes, whose caloric needs were immense, even small reductions in forest productivity could tip the balance, and yet it is important to emphasize that this was not the end. The period between 10 and 8 million years ago was transitional, a threshold rather than a collapse. Many ape species still flourished in certain refuges. In Africa, several lineages continued to experiment with diets and locomotion. In Asia, new forms appeared in the fossil record, showing that the lineage still held ecological ground. The carnival of the Miocene was not over, but the music was beginning to change. From a scientific perspective, the story of this cooling world is pieced together from scattered evidence. Fossil pollen records show shifts in plant communities, isotopic studies track changes in precipitation, and mammalian assemblages reveal the expansion of grazers. Together, they tell us that the 10 to 8 million year window was one of ecological tightening. Apes, once favoured by lush expanses, were increasingly pushed into the margins of shrinking forests. This was the first clear signal of crisis, the beginning of a long negotiation between lineage and environment. And here lies the unresolved tension. What does it mean for a lineage so successful to face a world withdrawing its support? The apes of this period were not less capable than those before, but the world itself had tilted. They had evolved for a planet of endless green, and the green was slowly fading. The lesson of this time is not about failure, but about fragility. Even the most exuberant evolutionary radiations are tethered to their environments, and when those environments change, the tether pulls tight. The world of 10 to 8 million years ago was cooling, drying, shifting. The apes felt it first in the trees, and their story reminds us that success in one age can be the beginning of vulnerability in the next. One of the clearest ways we glimpse this transition is through the plants themselves. Fossilized leaves and ancient pollen grains preserved in sediments act like time capsules, showing a steady replacement of evergreen species with more drought-tolerant varieties. Oaks, chestnuts and maples spread further, while tropical hardwoods retreated. Grass pollen also begins to appear more frequently in records from this time, indicating that open patches of grassy terrain were becoming more common. To an ape accustomed to continuous canopies, this would have meant journeys broken by treeless gaps, a dangerous inconvenience that forced greater energy expenditure. The forest was no longer a single connected world, but a mosaic stitched together by fragments. Lakes and rivers too record the signs of a cooler, less predictable climate. Cores taken from ancient lake beds show fluctuations in water levels and chemistry, pointing to longer dry seasons punctuated by brief, intense rains. For fruit-bearing trees, such irregularity could have disrupted flowering and fruiting cycles, making food availability less reliable. A group of apes that once could move predictably between seasonal food sources may have found themselves facing leaner months, their diets stretched to the limits of what their teeth and guts could handle. At the same time, predators were adjusting as well. Fossil evidence indicates a rise in carnivore diversity in Eurasia during this interval, with cats and canids spreading into regions where forests gave way to more open ground. For apes, whose safety had always been tied to the vertical refuge of trees, every open crossing carried higher risks. The balance of power within ecosystems was shifting, not in dramatic cataclysms, but in slow increments that added up over thousands of years. Even migration patterns began to reflect these new realities. As corridors of forest closed, populations of apes became more isolated. Genetic exchange between groups separated by stretches of grassland would have been harder to maintain, and isolation often leads to evolutionary divergence, or decline if populations become too small. The connectivity that once allowed apes to spread across continents was beginning to fray. To imagine this world is to picture landscapes in flux. A journey of a few kilometres could take an ape from dense, fruit-laden groves into sparse woodlands dotted with grazing antelopes and early bovids. The song of birds in the canopy would give way to the low rustle of grasses, and the security of branches would end at the edge of the clearing. The Miocene forests were not gone, but they were no longer endless. They were being pulled apart into fragments, each a reminder that climates never stand still. This was the first whisper of an ecological future that would demand adaptation. The apes of 10 to 8 million years ago faced a puzzle: how to continue thriving in forests that no longer stretched forever, in habitats that no longer delivered their gifts with certainty. It was not yet collapse, but it was the unmistakable beginning of change. What do fossils in Turkey tell us about ape experiments in survival? Around 9 to 8 million years ago, the region we now call Anatolia sat at a geological crossroads. Africa and Eurasia were pressing against one another, seas were withdrawing, and a patchwork of ecosystems stretched across the land. This was not a single uniform forest, but a mosaic of open woodlands, river valleys, and shrinking groves. It was into this varied setting that some of the last great ape lineages of Europe and Western Asia ventured, leaving behind traces that still surprise researchers today. These fossils suggest that even as climates cooled and forests fragmented, apes continued to experiment with survival strategies. One of the most intriguing of these discoveries is Anatolia, described in detail only recently after a fossil skull was unearthed in central Turkey. The preservation is remarkable. A partial face, parts of the jaw, and teeth that allow paleontologists to reconstruct its appearance and lifestyle with unusual clarity. Anatolia was large-bodied, likely heavier than many earlier Miocene apes, with a face that bore some resemblance to later African lineages. Its molars had thick enamel, suggesting a diet that included harder, more abrasive foods, such as nuts, seeds, or fibrous plants. This is a striking departure from the fruit-heavy diets of earlier European apes, like Dryopithecus, and it suggests adaptation to the mixed woodland and savanna-like environments that were spreading across Anatolia at the time. Nearby in the fossil record appears Great Ape, known from finds in Greece and the Balkans, but closely tied to this same broader region of southeastern Europe and Western Asia. Great is represented by jaws and teeth whose thick enamel and robust structure echo similar dietary adaptations. Together, these apes indicate that the populations of the late Miocene were experimenting with resilience in drier, more seasonal landscapes. No longer able to rely on year-round fruit from continuous canopies, they shifted toward fallback foods that could be chewed and processed when conditions turned lean. The landscapes in which they lived were equally transitional. Geological studies of Anatolian sediments reveal deposits that speak of alternating environments, patches of woodland alongside more open grasslands, streams lined with trees, and drier uplands nearby. Fossil assemblages from these layers include not only primates but antelopes, early gazelles, rhinoceroses and elephants, animals associated with more open habitats. To live here required versatility. Anatolia and Great were not forest specialists in the way that Dryopithecus had been. They were ecological opportunists, testing whether apes could endure outside the dense rainforest and within the patchier, harsher settings of a cooling world. From a scientific perspective, what makes these finds so important is not only their anatomy, but their timing. They date to just after the peak of the Miocene's ape diversity, when many lineages in Europe were already beginning to disappear. Yet in this corner of Anatolia, apes still thrived, leaving fossils that suggest persistence in places where the environment provided a balance of wooded refuge and open ground resources. This hints at the possibility that such mosaic habitats may have acted as refugia, temporary shelters where apes could hold on while more homogeneous forests vanished elsewhere. The significance of these discoveries also lies in how they expand our image of what apes were capable of. Too often, we think of apes as creatures locked to trees, vulnerable outside the canopy. Anatolia and Great complicate that picture. They suggest that apes were more flexible than we once believed, able to cope with seasonal food shortages, able to adapt their teeth and jaws to new challenges, and willing to test life in landscapes that were neither endless forest nor fully open plain. These were apes straddling worlds, inhabiting an in-between ecology that demanded compromise. And yet, as rich as these fossils are, they also remind us of the limits of knowledge. A single jaw, a partial skull, a scattering of teeth. This is what survives of entire species that once lived, bred, and roamed across valleys and ridges. From them we infer body size, diet, and habitat preferences, but vast details of their behaviour, social structure, and appearance are lost. Were they loud and territorial like modern baboons? Did they form tight family groups like gibbons or larger, looser bands like chimpanzees? The fossils are silent on such matters. We are left to imagine, cautiously, the possibilities. Still, what we can say with confidence is that Anatolia's apes stood at the edge of change. They were not relics clinging to old habits, but pioneers adapting to new ones. They reveal that even in times of ecological contraction, life does not simply vanish, It tries new strategies, shifts into new shapes, and tests new diets. The apes of Turkey, 9 to 8 million years ago, were part of that ongoing experiment, living proof that adaptability was possible even in a cooling, drying world. Their story is neither triumph nor tragedy but testament, a reminder that apes were not passive victims of climate, but active participants in the constant dialogue between body, environment and survival. In the mosaic landscapes of Anatolia, the conversation continued, and the echoes of that dialogue still reach us today in the fragments of bone pulled from the soil. What makes Anatolia particularly fascinating in this period is how it functioned as a natural bridge. Positioned between Europe, Asia and the Middle East, the region was subject to waves of faunal exchange. Fossil evidence shows antelopes and giraffids moving in from Africa, bovids expanding from Asia, and carnivores spreading from Europe. Apes living here were not isolated. They were part of a dynamic crossroad where new competitors and new prey appeared in quick succession. The fact that primates managed to persist in this shifting mix of species underscores their ability to improvise. They were not occupying empty forests, but landscapes where browsers, grazers and predators were constantly arriving and disappearing, creating a stage in perpetual motion. The sediments of central Anatolia also reveal hints about the vegetation that sustained these apes. Fossil pollen and plant impressions suggest a patchwork of broadleaf trees, shrubs, and seasonal grasses. This environment was neither the dense jungle that had once favoured fruit specialists nor the treeless plains that would later dominate Eurasia. Instead, it was a transitional landscape, forests broken by open glades and dry patches. Such conditions would have required apes to be mobile, travelling further between feeding sites and coping with periodic shortages. The adaptations in their jaws and teeth speak to this reality. Strong chewing surfaces for fallback foods, resilience when fruits were scarce, and versatility when choices narrowed. Anatolia's apes also invite questions about their social lives. Though no direct evidence remains, comparisons with modern primates allow cautious speculation. In more open environments, larger groups can be advantageous for spotting predators and defending resources. It is possible that some of these apes lived in bands that were larger than the smaller family groups of earlier, strictly arboreal species. If so, this would have marked a shift in primate behaviour, driven not by preference, but by necessity. Living in mosaics meant facing risks in open ground, and numbers may have been a form of insurance. Perhaps the most striking element of the Anatolian story is how little we knew about it until recently. For decades, the narrative of ape evolution focused on Africa, and, to a lesser extent, on Western Europe. The discoveries in Turkey have redrawn the map, showing that the late Miocene was more complex and widespread than previously imagined. Each new skull or jaw pulled from the dusty hillsides reveals another clue, another reminder that evolution is not a straight road but a network of paths, some leading forward, many leading nowhere, all shaped by the environments through which they passed. In this light, Anatolia stands as more than a geographic footnote. It was a proving ground, a place where apes adapted to uncertainty and tested how far flexibility could take them. The fossils may be few, but they capture a moment when the lineage was still exploring possibilities, still searching for ways to endure in a world that was beginning to close its forests and open its plains. Who were the first apes to vanish, and why? By 8 million years ago, the great carnival of ape diversity that had spread across Europe was beginning to falter. The forests that had once supported a dazzling variety of primates were thinning, giving way to seasonal woodlands and stretches of open terrain. In this new ecological framework, the highly specialised fruit-eating apes of Europe faced mounting challenges. Their adaptations, once perfectly suited to the lush canopies of the mid-Miocene, became liabilities as the climate cooled and resources grew scarce. The first true wave of ape disappearances can be traced to this period, when lineages like Dryopithecus and Oreopithecus dwindled and eventually disappeared. Dryopithecus had been one of the most successful European apes during the earlier Miocene, with fossils found in Spain, France, Germany and Hungary. It was a consummate forest dweller, with long arms adapted for suspensory movement and teeth that reveal a diet dominated by fruits. Its very success in exploiting soft, energy-rich foods had helped it spread across the continent. Yet by 8 million years ago, that specialization had become its undoing. Pollen records and sedimentary data reveal that European forests were retreating as the climate cooled, creating more seasonal environments. Fruit-bearing trees no longer provided a continuous supply, and Dryopithecus lacked the dental robustness to process the tougher fallback foods that dominated in lean seasons. What had once been its ecological strength, the ability to exploit soft fruit efficiently, now became a trap. Oreopithecus, though more enigmatic, tells a similar story of ecological limits. Found primarily in Tuscany and Sardinia, Oreopithecus lived in swampy habitats that may have been somewhat isolated from mainland ecosystems. Its skeletal structure is unusual, with features suggesting both arboreal climbing and possible experiments in upright posture. Its teeth, however, indicate a highly specialized diet of low-quality vegetation found in wetland environments. For a time, this niche may have insulated Oreopithecus from direct competition with other apes, allowing it to persist in its peculiar insular ecosystem. But specialization comes at a price. As wetland habitats shifted and resources became more variable, Oreopithecus too faced narrowing options. The very traits that had sustained it left little room for adjustment when its ecosystem contracted. The decline of these apes was not sudden but gradual, stretched across hundreds of thousands of years. Fossil deposits from this time show a marked reduction in ape diversity across Europe. In their place, mammals better suited to open woodlands and grasslands began to proliferate. Antelopes, deer, and horses expanded, along with predators capable of exploiting these new prey. Apes, tied to arboreal strategies, found themselves increasingly stranded. The forests became fragmented islands in a wider sea of grassland, and each fragment supported fewer and fewer primates. What is striking is how this pattern repeats across regions. In one area after another, species that had thrived in stable forests succumbed when those forests receded. It was not that they were poorly designed or less fit in some general sense, but that they were exquisitely adapted to an environment that no longer existed. This is one of the paradoxes of evolution. The traits that guarantee success in one age can guarantee vulnerability in the next. Dryopithecus and Oreopithecus were not failures in their own time. They were the apex of arboreal adaptation in Europe. Their disappearance was not the result of weakness, but of the world changing around them. The fossils that remain, fragmentary jaws, teeth, and bones, tell this story in outline. From them we can reconstruct the anatomy, the diet, and the ecological role of these apes. But the details of their social lives and behaviours are lost. Did Dryopithecus groups wander farther and farther in search of fruit as forests shrank? Did Oreopithecus cling to dwindling wetlands until the last resources ran dry? These questions remain open, and perhaps will never be fully answered, yet the pattern is clear. Europe's apes were the first major casualties of the late Miocene cooling. Their vanishing marks a turning point in primate history. The apes had once been dominant across Europe, but by 8 million years ago they were retreating, their range contracting, their diversity collapsing. What remained were only scattered populations in marginal habitats, a shadow of the golden age that had preceded them. The first losers of the Miocene were not erased because they lacked sophistication or strength, but because their specialized ties to dense, fruit-rich forests tethered them to a vanishing world. The lesson they leave is sobering. Evolution can reward specialization, but when environments shift, specialists are often the first to go. Europe's apes remind us that survival depends not only on what a species can do, but on whether the world continues to provide the conditions that make those abilities valuable. 8 million years ago, the balance tipped, and the forests that once sang with the calls of Dryopithecus and Oreopithecus fell quiet. One of the most revealing aspects of this decline is how unevenly it played out across the continent. In parts of Central Europe, where river valleys still supported strips of woodland, apes may have clung on for longer than in drier uplands. Fossils from Hungary suggest late surviving populations of Dryopithecus, their remains mixed with those of elephants, rhinoceroses, and browsing antelopes. These associations show that the apes were not living in pristine forests anymore, but in a patchwork landscape where wooded corridors ran through more open terrain. In such environments, survival likely demanded longer daily ranges and greater risk-taking, with individuals crossing exposed ground to reach scattered fruiting trees. Every journey carried more danger than before, The island-like habitats of southern Europe also shaped the fate of species such as Oreopithecus. Cut off from mainland populations, it may have faced not just ecological but also genetic constraints. Small, isolated groups are vulnerable to inbreeding and loss of diversity, which can reduce their ability to adapt. Fossil studies suggest Oreopithecus developed odd anatomical traits. Some researchers describe its pelvis and lower limbs as unusual, even maladaptive by comparison with its contemporaries. Whether these changes were part of an evolutionary experiment or symptoms of long-term isolation is still debated, but they underline how shrinking ranges can trap species in evolutionary corners. What is often overlooked is that these disappearances were not simply stories of replacement. There is little evidence that monkeys, which today dominate much of the Old World primate spectrum, had yet expanded significantly into Europe at this time. Nor were apes necessarily outcompeted by other primates. Instead, their decline reflects the loss of the very ecological foundation that sustained them. Forest specialists can only persist if forests themselves persist. When trees gave way to grasses, the equation collapsed, no matter how skilled or well adapted the apes had once been. This perspective also invites us to consider the tempo of extinction. The word itself conjures images of sudden loss, but for Dryopithecus and Oreopithecus it was almost certainly gradual, stretched over thousands of generations. Populations shrank, ranges contracted, and the calls of apes grew fewer in the forests of Europe until they fell silent altogether. To imagine this is to imagine not a single catastrophic event, but a slow, quiet fading of presence, one valley at a time. The first losers of the late Miocene remind us that extinction often begins long before the final individual dies. It begins when ranges fragment, when food sources falter, when once connected populations are cut into isolated pockets. By the time the fossil record falls silent, much of the struggle has already played out. Europe's apes were the first to encounter this fate, the earliest warning that the cooling world would not allow all lineages to remain. Why did Asia keep its apes longer than Europe? Between 8 and 6 million years ago, as the Miocene drew toward its close, the story of primate survival split along continental lines. In Europe, the calls of apes had fallen quiet, their diversity extinguished as forests receded and grasslands took hold. But across Asia, scattered populations endured, their fossils marking refugees in India, China, and Southeast Asia. The difference was not due to superior strength or intelligence, but to geography, climate, and the presence of ecological shelters that allowed some lineages to cling on while their European relatives faded away. The key to this survival lay in refugia, pockets of suitable habitat that persisted even as global conditions cooled. Asia's geography, with its complex mix of monsoon systems, mountain ranges, and river basins, provided such refuges. While Europe became increasingly seasonal and arid, Asia's subtropical belts maintained patches of evergreen and mixed forest, fed by periodic rains. In these mosaics, apes found the continuity they needed. Not vast, unbroken canopies like those of the mid-Miocene, but enough cover, fruiting trees and safe corridors to support small populations. These ecological islands served as bridges between past abundance and future scarcity. One of the most important groups to endure in these Asian refugees were the ancestors of today's orangutans. Oreopithecus, with fossils uncovered in Pakistan and India, represents one of the clearest links. Its face, with a concave profile and tall oval eye sockets, bears striking resemblance to the modern orangutan. Yet its body proportions suggest it was not fully committed to arboreal suspension in the same way. Oreopithecus occupied a transitional niche, perhaps moving through both trees and the ground, relying on fruits but able to incorporate tougher foods when necessary. Its persistence until around 8 to 7 million years ago shows that Asia's patchy forests still provided enough for fruit specialists to survive. Another genus, Oreopithecus, discovered in Thailand, pushes the lineage closer to what we now recognize in orangutans. Its teeth and jaw structures point to a diet anchored in fruits, while its anatomy shows adaptations for climbing. The fossil evidence suggests that as forests contracted, Oreopithecus held to the remaining strongholds of dense canopy in Southeast Asia. Unlike Europe, where forests vanished almost completely, these regions still offered humid pockets where fruit-bearing trees remained abundant enough to sustain large-bodied primates. Asia also hosted a broader cast of apes during this interval. Lufengpithecus in China, for instance, reveals another strand of late Miocene survival. Fossil skulls from Yunnan province display a combination of traits distinct from both African and European apes, showing how local populations followed their own evolutionary pathways. Lufengpithecus lived as late as 6 million years ago, coexisting with forests that persisted in the subtropical valleys of southwestern China. Its endurance demonstrates the importance of geography. Where terrain trapped moisture and maintained vegetation, apes could still hold on, even as surrounding landscapes dried. What unites these Asian survivors is not a single adaptation, but flexibility. They were not as heavily tied to the strict fruit specialization of European Dryopithecus, nor as ecologically narrow as Oreopithecus. Their teeth reveal an ability to process a wider range of foods, from fruits to tougher vegetation. Their habitats were patchy, demanding tolerance of more open edges and seasonal shortages. This capacity for compromise allowed them to endure where others could not. The animal communities they lived among also differed from those in Europe. Fossil assemblages in late Miocene Asia include not only bovids and elephants, but a diversity of primates and carnivores adapted to mixed habitats. Apes in these settings were part of a shifting balance, not dominant, but not absent either. They were no longer the uncontested rulers of the canopy, but participants in more complex ecosystems where survival required sharing space with grazers, browsers, and predators alike. The persistence of apes in Asia between 8 and 6 million years ago underscores the role of environment in shaping evolutionary outcomes. Europe had simply become inhospitable to them, its forests too fragmented, its seasons too harsh. Asia, by contrast, retained ecological shelters where apes could adapt and persist. It was not inevitability or destiny that spared them, but chance geography and climatic variation. And yet, even as we trace their survival, we sense fragility. These were not thriving populations expanding into new territories, but remnant groups clinging to the landscapes that remained. Their fossils remind us that evolutionary endurance is often precarious, dependent not only on anatomy and behaviour, but on the unpredictable mercy of environment. Asia's apes managed to hang on longer than their European kin, but their survival was already a narrowing path, shaped by the patchwork of forests shrinking around them. One of the subtler reasons Asia became a sanctuary for apes lies in its climatic rhythms. The onset of the Asian monsoon system created cycles of heavy rainfall that, even during cooler global periods, could sustain belts of greenery. These rains nourished river valleys and lowland basins, producing strips of dense forest that functioned like lifelines for primates. In Europe, where rainfall was increasingly erratic and winters more severe, there was no such dependable system to anchor the forests. In Asia, though, these monsoon-fed refugees gave apes more time, more continuity, and more places to retreat when the broader climate grew less forgiving. The fossil record also shows that Asia preserved not just apes, but their ecological partners. In sites from Yunnan to northern India, paleontologists have found plant remains alongside primate fossils that include figs and other fruiting species still important in ape diets today. Figs, in particular, fruit multiple times a year, offering a stable food source even in seasonal environments. The presence of these trees may have been crucial to the survival of Lufengpithecus, Siveopithecus, and their relatives, providing reliable nutrition when other resources ran thin. In contrast, Europe's late Miocene forests lacked such consistent fallback species, leaving its apes more vulnerable to shortages. Asia's geography also created natural barriers that could protect small populations. Mountain ranges like the Himalayas and uplands across Southeast Asia acted as both walls and weathermakers. Valleys shielded from dry winds retained moisture, and ridges funneled rainfall into pockets of habitat. Within these microclimates, apes endured, sometimes evolving distinct traits in relative isolation. This helps explain why the late Miocene record of Asia is so diverse, with genera like Oreopithecus in Thailand, Siveopithecus in Pakistan, and Lufengpithecus in China, all flourishing at roughly the same time, each in its own ecological niche. The endurance of these apes also highlights the difference between persistence and dominance. By this stage, apes were no longer the widespread, abundant figures they had been earlier in the Miocene. Their presence in Asia was more localized, often tied to very specific habitats. They survived not because they conquered the landscape, but because they adapted to its shrinking corners. Their story is not one of triumph over adversity, but of endurance in its shadow. Seen from today, their persistence carries a quiet irony. The ancestors of orangutans survived by remaining tied to forests that still echoed with figs, vines, and seasonal rains, but that very dependence would make them vulnerable again in later ages of change. Asia let its apes hang on longer, but it also preserved their reliance on habitats that could vanish in an instant. Their survival was real but precarious, brought not by mastery of new worlds, but by the luck of living in places where the old world lingered just a little longer. What happens when apes meet open grasslands for the first time? Around 7 to 6 million years ago, the landscapes of Africa and Eurasia began to look unfamiliar to the forest-adapted apes that had dominated for so long. Climate continued to cool and dry, and with it, the dense canopies that had sheltered primates for millions of years fragmented further. In their place came mosaics, patchworks of forest, woodland, and expanding stretches of savanna grassland. For arboreal species that had spent their lives swinging through branches and feeding on fruits above the ground, this transformation was nothing short of a shock. The savannas introduced new dangers, new foods, and new possibilities. Some apes could not adapt and faded from the record. Others began to experiment with new ways of moving and surviving, leaving us with tantalizing fossils that mark the dawn of a different path. The geological and paleo-environmental evidence for this transition is clear. Isotopic studies of ancient soils from East Africa show a rising dominance of grasses adapted to dry conditions. Fossil assemblages from this period include antelopes, gazelles, and early forms of grazing horses, animals that thrived in open habitats. This shift was not uniform across the continent, but occurred in pulses, with wetter refuges persisting in some valleys while dry grasslands advanced elsewhere. The effect was a mosaic environment, one that no longer guaranteed the safety of continuous canopy cover. For apes, this meant venturing down from the trees more often, navigating exposed ground, and finding new strategies for accessing resources. It is in this context that we encounter some of the earliest fossils often described as bipedal experiments. Sahelanthropus chadensis, discovered in Chad, lived around 7 million years ago. Its skull shows a mix of traits, ape-like in its brain size and heavy brow ridges, but with a foramen magnum, the hole where the spinal cord enters, the skull positioned more forward, suggesting an upright posture when moving. The interpretation remains debated, but many researchers see in Sahelanthropus a creature already testing the advantages of standing and walking in more open habitats. Another fossil, Oreopithecus from Kenya, dating to around 6 million years ago, preserves parts of the femur that appear adapted to bearing weight in an upright stance. The structure of the thigh bone suggests it could support bipedal locomotion, at least part of the time. Yet Oreopithecus' arms also show climbing adaptations, indicating a life still tied to trees. Together, these fossils hint at creatures straddling two worlds, part arboreal, part terrestrial, navigating environments that no longer permitted exclusivity to either. For the apes that remained primarily in the trees, the Savannah Shock brought disadvantages. Open grasslands exposed them to predators such as big cats and hyenas, which were themselves diversifying during this period. Moving between isolated forest patches meant crossing dangerous ground. Fruit supplies became more seasonal, demanding fallback strategies of bark, leaves, or tougher seeds. Those unable to adjust their diets or behaviours dwindled. It was not that the forest vanished entirely. They persisted in belts along rivers and mountains, but they were no longer the dominant biome, and apes specialised in continuous canopy were forced into ever-shrinking refuges. The emergence of upright posture in some lineages may have been one of several solutions to these challenges. Standing on two legs allowed a wider field of view over tall grasses, spotting predators or distant trees. It also freed the hands to carry food while moving between patches. Though still experimental, these traits show how the savanna landscapes acted as a crucible, testing novel forms of locomotion and survival. Not all of these experiments would persist, but they represent critical steps in how primates adapted to environments that no longer resembled the Miocene's endless forests. Asia, too, felt echoes of these changes, though with local variations. In Yunnan, apes like Lufengpithecus still thrived in subtropical valleys, holding to forests where climate permitted. Yet even in these regions, the trend towards seasonality was clear. The late Miocene was not kind to forest specialists, and survival required flexibility. The contrasting fates of Asia and Africa during this time highlight how global climate patterns created regional differences in survival, but the pressure to adapt was universal. What the Savannah Shock teaches us is that ecological upheaval is often both destructive and creative. It narrowed the range of options for many apes, eliminating those unable to cope with fragmentation. Yet it also opened opportunities for experimentation, new diets, new ways of moving, new strategies of endurance. The fossils of Sahelanthropus and Aurorin are not blueprints for the future, but snapshots of possibilities being tested in landscapes of uncertainty. They remind us that the path from the trees to the ground was not straightforward, but tentative, shaped by necessity and chance. By 7 to 6 million years ago, the world of apes had already been dramatically reduced from its earlier glory. Europe had lost its last lineages, Asia held on in pockets, and Africa's primates were beginning to face the open. It was a turning point not only in the history of apes, but in the broader story of primates adapting to changing worlds. The savannas forced choices, and in those choices we glimpsed the resilience and vulnerability of a lineage caught between two habitats. What happens when apes meet grasslands is not just a question of survival in the past, but a reminder of how deeply landscapes shape the possibilities of life. One of the most revealing indicators of this ecological upheaval comes not from bones, but from the chemistry of ancient soils and teeth. Carbon isotope analysis of fossil herbivores from this period shows a growing reliance on grasses that use a different photosynthetic pathway than trees and shrubs. These isotopic signals confirm that vast tracts of land were shifting from forest to open grassland, altering the entire food web. Apes could not ignore this transition because their plant-based diets were directly tied to what the landscape provided. Those that continued to depend heavily on fruit had to track dwindling forest corridors, while others began sampling tougher foods at the margins, pushing their anatomy toward new solutions. Predator-prey dynamics also changed dramatically. Grassland supported faster, more cursorial carnivores, and fossil trackways suggest packs of canids and early felids chasing herds of grazing animals. For an ape on the ground, this meant that moving between patches of trees was no casual stroll. It was a dangerous gamble that demanded vigilance, coordination, and perhaps even new group behaviours. To travel openly across a savanna without the cover of branches was to step into an arena dominated by predators built for speed. Survival in such spaces required not only physical adjustments, but also shifts in social strategies, though the fossil record leaves us to infer these changes indirectly. It is worth noting that the shift to mosaic landscapes did not erase arboreal life altogether. Pockets of gallery forest still lined rivers, and upland areas retained patches of evergreen cover. These served as safe havens where apes could continue a more traditional way of life, but they were increasingly isolated from one another. A group living in one valley might find itself cut off from its neighbours, with little chance of exchanging individuals or maintaining genetic diversity. In this sense, the Savannah Shock did not merely reduce ape numbers, it fragmented them into scattered enclaves, each facing its own struggles. Fossil pollen and plant impressions from lake sediments reinforced this picture of patchwork. Grasses dominated the plains, but alongside them grew seasonal shrubs and drought-resistant trees. Such vegetation produced different cycles of food availability than tropical forests. Instead of a constant buffet of fruits, apes were confronted with pulses of abundance followed by long periods of scarcity. This rhythm demanded either extraordinary patience or new ways of coping. It is within this demanding ecological tempo that we see the first anatomical hints of upright movement, signs that some apes were beginning to respond to landscapes where efficiency on the ground mattered as much as agility in the trees. The Savannah Shock was, in many ways, the great filter of the late Miocene. It did not immediately erase all arboreal apes, nor did it instantly favour terrestrial adaptations. Rather, it forced species to live in tension between old strategies and new demands, a tension visible in fossils that show a mixture of climbing and upright traits. The outcome of this balancing act would decide which lineages endured and which disappeared into the silence of the grasslands. How long can the largest ape ever cling to life? Between 6 and 2 million years ago, deep in the forests of southern China and Southeast Asia, a primate of extraordinary proportions moved through the undergrowth. Known today as Gigantopithecus, this creature was the undisputed heavyweight of the primate world, a giant that may have stood close to 3 meters tall and weighed nearly 300 kilograms. It was not a sprinter, not a leaper, not an agile acrobat of the branches. Instead, it was built for sheer size, for the slow, deliberate consumption of huge volumes of vegetation. Its story is unusual not just for its magnitude, but for its longevity. For millions of years, long after other lineages of great apes had disappeared from Eurasia, Gigantopithecus endured, holding on until only about 200,000 years ago. Its persistence offers a case study in both the power and the peril of evolutionary specialization. We know Gigantopithecus almost entirely from its teeth and jaws, many of which were first discovered not in scientific excavations, but in traditional Chinese apothecaries, where fossilized remains were sold as so-called dragon bones. The scale of these molars and mandibles was immediately striking. They were massive, dwarfing those of gorillas or orangutans, with thick enamel surfaces designed to grind fibrous material. No complete skeleton has ever been found, which means reconstructions of its posture and locomotion remain uncertain. Yet the teeth alone make it clear that this was no ordinary ape. To support such a body required extraordinary amounts of food, and its anatomy was geared toward processing tough vegetation day after day. Evidence suggests that Gigantopithecus specialized in diets rich in fibrous plants, likely including bamboo and other tough grasses that grew in abundance across its range. Microwear analysis on teeth reveals patterns consistent with heavy grinding, and isotopic studies reinforce the picture of a species reliant on C3 plants, such as bamboo, rather than fruits. This dietary choice provided both opportunity and constraint. Bamboo grows quickly and regenerates after being cut or consumed, creating a renewable resource. It allowed Gigantopithecus to sustain its vast body in environments where fruit was too seasonal or scarce to support an animal of its size. Yet bamboo also carries risks. When forests shifted, or bamboo stands collapsed under climatic stress, the very foundation of its survival strategy could vanish. Despite these risks, Gigantopithecus thrived for millions of years, far longer than most primate experiments in gigantism. Its endurance suggests that bamboo and other fibrous plants remained reliable enough for much of this time, and that its slow, deliberate lifestyle was viable in the dense subtropical forests of Asia. Unlike the European apes that vanished by 8 million years ago, Gigantopithecus occupied habitats that remained relatively stable, buffered by monsoon rains and regional geography. For generation after generation, it wandered the forests, grinding through its meals, a giant presence largely hidden from view. Yet its very bulk, the trait that made it so distinctive, may also have been its greatest limitation. Large size insulated it from predators and allowed it to dominate patches of forest, but it also imposed immense caloric demands. A Gigantopithecus needed vast amounts of food to survive, and if supply faltered, starvation could follow quickly. Small primates could dart between trees and supplement their diets with insects or fruits. Gigantopithecus had fewer options. Its jaws were perfect for grinding bamboo, but not for versatility. It was a specialist, and specialists are always tied to the fate of their environment. The persistence of this giant into the relatively recent past, only about 200,000 years ago, is remarkable. At a time when most of the Miocene apes were long gone, Gigantopithecus still lived in the forests of southern China, Vietnam and Thailand. It is almost eerie to imagine that such a colossal primate survived into an age when climates were beginning to oscillate more violently, and other mammals were adapting to increasingly open habitats. That it lasted so long is a testament to the stability of its refuges. That it ultimately disappeared speaks to the limits of specialization when climates shifted one time too many. Gigantopithecus stands in stark contrast to the smaller, more flexible apes of the same era. While its contemporaries in Asia pursued mixed diets, used smaller ranges, or retained agility in the canopy, Gigantopithecus doubled down on size and plant fibre. For millions of years this gamble paid off, making it the last of the giants in a lineage that had once explored body sizes across the spectrum. its eventual disappearance reminds us that no adaptation, however successful in one era, guarantees survival in the next. The story of Gigantopithecus is both inspiring and sobering. Inspiring because it shows how long a lineage can endure when a niche is stable and abundant. Sobering because it demonstrates the vulnerability of tying survival to a single strategy. For nearly 4 million years, Asia's forests sustained the mightiest ape ever to live, and then, in the blink of geological time, the forest shifted and the giant was gone. One of the most fascinating aspects of Gigantopithecus is how invisible it feels despite its enormous size. Unlike mammoths or saber-toothed cats, which left behind skeletons scattered across the Pleistocene world, this giant ape lingers mostly through teeth and fragments of jaw. The forests it inhabited were dense, humid and acidic, conditions that rarely favour fossil preservation. This silence in the record creates a paradox. The largest primate ever to walk the earth is at the same time one of the least known. The scattered evidence we do possess suggests not a rare oddity, but an animal that must have existed in significant numbers for millions of years to leave behind the fossil traces we have. And yet its presence is ghost-like, inferred more from absence than abundance. Another clue comes from its distribution. Fossil remains attributed to Gigantopithecus have been found across a wide swath of Asia, from southern China to Thailand and Vietnam. This spread implies adaptability within its chosen niche, with populations thriving in different subtropical forests along the monsoon belt. Such a range would have required the ability to cope with slightly different climates, plant communities, and seasonal rhythms. Still, the common denominator was always dense forest with a dependable supply of fibrous plants. Gigantopithecus may have tolerated variation in detail, but it never strayed far from the environmental template that defined its success. Researchers have long debated what its daily life may have looked like. Some envision solitary giants moving slowly through the forest, consuming enormous quantities of bamboo shoots and leaves. Others suggest more social groupings, akin to gorilla bands with females and their young gathering around dominant males. The truth is elusive, locked away with behaviour that leaves no direct fossil trace. What is clear, however, is that such a large animal would have needed to manage space carefully. A single individual may have required a wide foraging territory, and too many giants in one area would have quickly stripped it bare. This suggests that populations were probably scattered, each group separated by stretches of forest sufficient to feed them. The very existence of Gigantopithecus also forces us to rethink what primates can be. Today, we associate apes with agility, intelligence, and behavioural flexibility. Gigantopithecus embodies a different path. Not quickness, not clever manipulation of objects, but endurance through mass and a single reliable diet. In this way, it resembles giant herbivores more than its smaller ape cousins, converging on a lifestyle that prioritised bulk and stability over versatility. It was, in effect, a primate that solved survival the way elephants or rhinos did, by becoming too large to easily challenge and too specialised to easily replace. Its persistence until only about 200,000 years ago highlights just how long such a strategy can succeed when the environment allows. For millions of years, Asia's forests provided the resources Gigantopithecus required. Only when those forests contracted past a critical threshold did its strategy fail. In that sense, its story is not one of weakness, but of ecological loyalty. An ape that bet everything on a habitat that had sustained life for ages, only to find that even the most enduring forests are not eternal. Imagine standing in the savannas of East Africa around 2 million years ago. The grasses ripple in the dry season wind, herds of antelope move cautiously between scattered acacia trees, and small predators skulk in the shade. But among the apes who walked this landscape, there was a group unlike any before or since. They did not tower like Gigantopithecus, nor did they vanish as quickly as the fragile forest apes of Europe. Instead, their survival strategy was written directly into their faces. Jaws built like anvils, teeth as wide as bottle caps, skulls thickened with ridges to anchor enormous chewing muscles. These were the robust Australopiths, a lineage we call Paranthropus, and their existence poses an intriguing question. What if survival meant not outsmarting the environment, but simply out-chewing it. The most famous of these heavy-jawed apes is Paranthropus boisei, often nicknamed Nutcracker Man. The name came from the sheer size of its molars, up to twice the breadth of ours, and from the assumption that such teeth were designed to pulverize hard nuts and seeds. Its skull bore a sagittal crest, a bony ridge along the top, where massive chewing muscles attached, running down to anchor at the jaw. The result was a bite force capable of grinding down some of the toughest foods available. Standing around 4 feet tall with a stocky build, Paranthropus boisei may not have looked like the giant it sometimes sounds like, but in the micro-world of chewing, it was unmatched. Yet, as often happens in science, the first interpretations proved too simple. Microscopic scratches on fossilized teeth, examined under modern instruments, reveal that these so-called nutcrackers were not actually crunching hard seeds every day. Instead, their preferred meals were probably softer foods such as grasses, sedges and tubers, plants rich in starch but difficult to process without specialized anatomy. The heavy jaws and massive teeth seem to have been an insurance policy, a toolkit for fallback foods during lean seasons. When fruits or tender vegetation was scarce, Paranthropus could survive on roots, stems, and gritty plant matter that would quickly wear down the teeth of other primates. It was less about what they always ate, and more about what they could eat when they had no choice. This evolutionary gamble created a lineage that lasted nearly 2 million years across parts of eastern and southern Africa. Fossils from Tanzania, Kenya, Ethiopia, and South Africa all testify to their broad distribution. In southern Africa, Paranthropus robustus shows a similar pattern of adaptation, with slightly smaller jaws than its East African cousin, but still far larger than any other primate of its time. Together, these robust forms reveal that evolution can favour not only intelligence, agility or cooperation, but also sheer toughness in anatomy. For an astonishing stretch of prehistory, they thrived by being the grinders of the savannah. But their lives were not easy. Living in open, seasonal environments meant constant exposure to drought cycles, shifting plant communities, and competition with grazing animals. The microwear on their teeth suggests a monotonous diet compared to other primates of the time. Imagine chewing fibrous stalks and gritty roots day after day, meals that filled the belly but offered little pleasure. Survival for Paranthropus may have been less about thriving and more about enduring. Their skeletal remains suggest they walked upright, but with builds more stocky and less gracile than other hominins of their age. In their posture and movements, they straddled a line between the familiar and the strange, clearly adapted for life on the ground, yet not venturing into the same ecological experiments as their slimmer cousins. One of the enduring puzzles is how such specialized creatures managed to survive for so long. Most evolutionary specialists, animals finely tuned to narrow diets or environments, tend to vanish quickly when conditions shift. Yet Paranthropus persisted for well over 1 million years, weathering environmental fluctuations that toppled many contemporaries. This durability likely reflects the reliability of underground storage organs, those hidden tubers and roots that can sustain grazers and browsers when grass is dry and fruits vanish. By evolving jaws that could process these difficult foods, Paranthropus tapped into a resource base that was steady, if uninspiring. Their fallback became their foundation, and yet, eventually this resilience faltered. By around 1 million years ago, the last traces of Paranthropus vanish from the fossil record. Why a lineage so well insured against scarcity disappeared remains uncertain. Perhaps further climate shifts tipped the balance against their habitats. Perhaps competition with other omnivores that could diversify diets more flexibly made their specialization less viable. Or perhaps their slow reproduction rates, coupled with ecological stress, wore them down over time. Whatever the cause, their story serves as a reminder that even toughness has its limits. The robust Australopiths are important not because they led directly to us, but because they show another way survival could have been pursued. If evolution had taken a different turn, perhaps the dominant primate on Earth would not be a tool-using generalist, but a jaw-powered specialist, an ape whose destiny was written not in symbols or fire but in enamel and bone. That they endured for so long proves their strategy worked, until it didn't. And their bones, with jaws shaped by millions of years of grinding, whisper back to us from the dry African ground, asking whether endurance alone is enough to weather the shifting trials of deep time. In studying the remains of Paranthropus, what strikes scientists is not only the size of the teeth, but the way their entire skull was restructured around this dietary commitment. The wide, flaring cheekbones created a kind of bony architecture that expanded the face outward, making room for the large temporalis muscles that powered the jaws. In practical terms, this meant that when Paranthropus bit down, its face could absorb and direct forces in a way our own delicate skulls could never handle. It was not a minor adjustment, but an entire evolutionary reorientation toward chewing. To look at a Paranthropus skull today is to see a creature sculpted by survival pressure into something almost alien, a living testament to the idea that sometimes strength comes from persistence rather than versatility. The environments in which Paranthropus thrived were patchy, unpredictable, and often unforgiving. Paleobotanical evidence from ancient sediments suggests cycles of wetter and drier periods across east and southern Africa. During wetter intervals, lush vegetation may have supported more diverse diets, but as drier seasons set in, grasses and tough shrubs dominated the landscape. Where other primates would have struggled, Paranthropus dug deeper, literally and figuratively, extracting hidden tubers and hard stems. The soil itself became part of their diet, as grit and sand embedded in roots left microscopic wear marks across their molars. These tiny scratches and pits, preserved over millions of years, tell us that the very earth shaped their survival strategy. Curiously, their presence overlaps with a range of other creatures: early antelopes, grazing hipparian horses, elephants with evolving tusk shapes, all of whom were also testing strategies for life in expanding grasslands. Paranthropus belonged to this experimental mosaic, not as a dominant form but as a specialist carving out a narrow ecological track. In this sense, their success was not in outcompeting rivals broadly, but in sidestepping competition altogether. Few animals wanted the fibrous fallback foods that Paranthropus could manage, which left them with a reliable, if monotonous, buffet. Still, there is evidence that their lives were not without danger. Fossils of Paranthropus show signs of stress: enamel hypoplasias, faint lines on teeth that indicate disruptions in growth, likely from episodes of malnutrition or disease. Their bodies may have been built for endurance, but they were not immune to the difficulties of fluctuating climates or scarce resources. Each generation had to weather the risks of droughts, predators, and competition from other primates and carnivores that shared their habitats. Endurance here was not heroic. It was daily survival at the edge of sufficiency. When we reconstruct their world, we must imagine not only the strength of their jaws but the silence of their existence. Unlike later hominins, there is no evidence that Paranthropus left behind tools, symbolic markings, or cultural traces. Their legacy is purely anatomical, preserved in bone and enamel. This absence does not make them lesser. It simply means they tell a different kind of story, one rooted in ecology rather than technology. They remind us that multiple paths once existed, each valid in its own right, each adapted to a different way of life. The disappearance of Paranthropus leaves an open question about the role of specialization in survival. Was their endurance for nearly 2 million years a triumph of adaptation, or a cautionary tale of overcommitment? We cannot say for certain. What we do know is that for a vast stretch of time, in landscapes dotted with acacias and swept by dry winds, there lived a primate lineage that chose strength over flexibility, and in so doing, secured its place in the unfolding experiment of life. Imagine a world between 2 and 1 million years ago. Forests have thinned, savannas have spread, rivers cut through grasslands, and across this restless landscape walks a figure unlike any before. It stands taller than its predecessors, strides with long legs, and carries with it not just bone and muscle, but the beginnings of something entirely new. This was Homo erectus, a species that, as far as we can tell, was the first to extend the reach of apes beyond Africa into Asia, the first to hunt with coordination across open plains, and perhaps the first to sit beside Firelight. The question that lingers is not whether these innovations changed their survival, but how profoundly they reshaped what it meant to be an ape in a world of shifting climates and disappearing forests. The fossil record of Homo erectus stretches from East Africa to Indonesia and China, a range unmatched by any ape before them. Where earlier primates were bound tightly to forests, Erectus moved with adaptability, appearing in environments as varied as grasslands, woodlands, and coastal zones. This expansion was not the mark of a specialist, but of a generalist armed with strategies that went beyond anatomy alone. Archaeological sites from East Africa show stone hand axes scattered across ancient riverbeds, their flaked edges testifying to deliberate shaping. These tools, belonging to what we call the Apulian tradition, were multi-purpose, capable of cutting meat, shaping wood, or cracking bones for marrow. Unlike the jaws of Paranthropus, which locked survival into one strategy, Homo erectus carried survival in its hands. But tools alone do not explain their success. Many researchers point to social cooperation as a key ingredient. Hunting large game required planning, communication, and shared effort. Evidence from cut-marked bones suggests that Homo erectus was not merely scavenging leftovers from predators, but actively participating in hunting and butchery. Imagine a group encircling a grazing herd, coordinated enough to drive prey into a narrow corridor where sharpened tools could deliver the final blow. No individual alone could have managed it. What mattered was the group, the ability to act as a collective force. With this came food that was richer in calories, protein, and fat than the fibrous fallback diets of other apes. This shift may have fueled not just their bodies but their brains, enabling further adaptations that fed back into the cycle of survival. And then there is fire. Charred bones and ash layers at sites like Wonderwork Cave in South Africa and at ancient open-air localities in East Africa and China suggest that by around 1 million years ago, Homo erectus may have been experimenting with controlling flames. The evidence is still debated. Natural fires leave traces that can mimic human use, but enough patterns emerge to make it plausible that some groups sat beside campfires. If true, the implications are immense. Firelight would have extended the day, kept predators at bay, and made food easier to digest. Cooking softens starches, releases calories locked in tough fibres, and reduces pathogens in meat. An ape that could carry fire could carry the landscape itself into its control, bending environments to its needs rather than bending to theirs. Mobility also distinguished Homo erectus. Fossils and tools appear across continents, from the Caucasus to Southeast Asia, showing that erectus not only endured environmental changes, but actively expanded into them. Their long legs and narrow hips suggest efficiency in walking and running, a body designed for covering distance across open ground. This meant that when droughts struck or prey shifted, erectus could follow. They were not tethered to a single patch of forest or a narrow diet, but roamed with adaptability. This wandering lineage became a thread tying together Africa and Asia in ways no ape had achieved before. There is humility in admitting how incomplete the record remains. We cannot yet know whether every hearth was made by human hands or by lightning. We cannot reconstruct the precise sound of their voices if they had words at all, or only gestures and calls. Yet even in the fragments of tools, bones, and burned earth, we glimpse a new mode of survival emerging. For the first time, survival did not hinge solely on anatomy, on teeth, jaws, or sheer size, but on shared strategies, technology, and perhaps even culture. In this sense, Homo erectus marked a turning point. They were still apes in body, but in behaviour they were something else. Pioneers of a path where endurance came not only from toughness but from imagination. And so, we are left to wonder, was it firelight sharpened stone, or the bond of cooperation that carried them further than any ape before? Or was it the fragile balance of all three, each feeding into the other, creating resilience greater than the sum of its parts? What we can say with some confidence is that between 2 and 1 million years ago, in a world of shifting savannas and spreading grasslands, one lineage of ape found a way to survive not just through muscle or teeth, but through ideas. If we look closer at the story of Homo erectus, what becomes clear is that survival was no longer a solitary negotiation with the landscape. It was increasingly a collective one. The traces of butchery left on animal bones suggest that carcasses were not simply consumed in the moment by individuals, but rather brought back and shared within groups. This act of carrying food implies foresight, a recognition that meals could be planned, distributed, and perhaps even owed. In such gestures lie the beginnings of obligation, of reciprocity, and of trust, qualities that are invisible in the fossil record but hinted at in the patterns of behaviour left behind. The survival advantages of such cooperation cannot be overstated. A lone scavenger might starve in a lean season, but a group that pooled its resources could endure much longer. Equally transformative was the way fire, if indeed controlled by Homo erectus, would have altered social life. To sit by a fire is not only to eat cooked food or to keep warm, it is to create a circle of safety where the night is pushed back, where conversation or gesture can unfold without the immediate threat of predators. Some anthropologists suggest that this might have been the first time apes experienced prolonged waking hours after dark, a kind of expansion of consciousness that reshaped daily rhythms. Even if words were absent, shared silence around firelight may have fostered forms of communication and bonding unique to this lineage. The first sparks of storytelling may have begun, not as spoken language but as gestures in the flickering shadows. Travel also reshaped the way Homo erectus interacted with the environment. Fossils found thousands of kilometres apart show that they not only dispersed widely, but were able to adapt to radically different conditions. Coastal sites hint at the exploitation of marine resources, while inland evidence shows hunting of terrestrial prey. This ability to flex between ecological zones demonstrates that they were not bound by one specific strategy. Instead, they were experimenting with versatility. It is possible that their migrations were not always intentional expansions, but sometimes slow drifts, following herds or seasonal rivers. Yet the end result was the same. Homo erectus became the first ape whose range mapped onto continents rather than just forests. What is humbling is how little we can still say with certainty. We find stone hand axes by the thousands, yet we cannot know the thoughts of the beings who shaped them. Were they proud of their work, teaching younger individuals how to flake stone, or was tool-making simply instinctual repetition? Did fire feel like mastery over nature, or was it treated with awe and caution? These are questions we may never answer. But the archaeological record makes one thing clear. Between 2 and 1 million years ago, Homo erectus lived differently than any ape before them. They stretched the boundaries of survival outward, carrying not only their bodies across landscapes, but also their ideas, habits, and possibly even their first sparks of culture. In that sense, the glow of firelight and the edge of sharpened stone were not just technologies, they were thresholds, opening a new way of being alive. Survival ceased to be only about endurance of the body, and became instead about the endurance of shared knowledge, carried in the hands and minds of groups who wandered far from their origins. The story of Homo erectus is not about one innovation, but about the way multiple strands of ingenuity and cooperation wove together into resilience that no other ape had achieved before. If we pause to consider what truly set some ancient apes apart from their cousins, the answer may lie not in size, nor in brute strength, nor even in specialized adaptations, but in something more subtle: flexibility. Between 2 and 1 million years ago, the fossil record shows a striking contrast between species that narrowed themselves into dietary or environmental traps and those that broadened their scope. Where some were built to chew roots or to cling to shrinking forests, others seemed to thrive by being generalists, able to make a living in nearly any habitat, with nearly any food source. This shift toward versatility may be one of the most powerful forces in evolution, a quiet but decisive edge that outlasted the grand experiments of the Miocene giants. In Africa during this period, the land was never still. Cycles of glaciation elsewhere in the world pushed climate belts back and forth, bringing pulses of rainfall followed by drought. Grasslands advanced, only to retreat again, and lakes expanded or dried up within a few generations. For a species tied too tightly to one ecological setting, these swings were devastating. Paranthropus, with its heavy jaws, could hold out for long stretches on tough vegetation, but it was locked into a narrow strategy. Gigantopithecus, still persisting in Asian forests, relied on the abundance of bamboo and forest fruits, a diet vulnerable to even modest environmental shifts. In contrast, the early members of Homo, particularly Homo erectus, seemed able to cross these ecological boundaries with relative ease. Evidence from archaeological sites shows a dietary breadth unmatched by any other ape. Bones marked with cut lines reveal that meat and marrow were on the menu, but so too were plants of many kinds, tubers, seeds, and perhaps even opportunistic shellfish where coastal access allowed. Stone tools were not specialised in the way jaws were. A sharp-edged hand axe could cut, scrape, dig, and crush. This technological generalism reflected and amplified the dietary one. Instead of evolving teeth for only one type of food, Homo had evolved hands and cognition that could extract calories from multiple sources. This flexibility may have buffered them against the relentless unpredictability of their environment. The geographic spread of Homo erectus is also a testament to this adaptability. Fossils appear from Kenya and Ethiopia, but also in Georgia, at Dmanisi, in Java, and in northern China. Such a range required more than luck. It demanded the capacity to find food in different ecosystems, to adjust to different predators, and to endure climates ranging from tropical heat to temperate chill. No single anatomical specialization could explain this success. Instead, it was the willingness or the capacity to be general that opened these worlds. Where a bamboo forest collapse might doom Gigantopithecus, or where the disappearance of forest fruits spelled the end for European Dryopithecines, Homo erectus could move, adjust, and continue. It is tempting to imagine this generalism as merely pragmatic, but it may have also fostered deeper resilience. Generalists, by definition, are not tied to the fate of any single resource. This creates stability, allowing populations to grow larger and more interconnected, reducing the risk of collapse. A species that can eat both meat and tubers, both fruits and marrow, can survive seasonal swings that would destroy a more specialized competitor. In evolutionary terms, being a jack of all trades can sometimes mean being master of survival. The fossil record supports this picture of adaptability. At sites like Kubifora in Kenya, Homo erectus remains are found alongside a range of fauna, from grazing antelope to browsing giraffes, showing that they inhabited mosaic landscapes that shifted between open grassland and wooded environments. The ability to exploit both ends of this ecological spectrum is extraordinary. Where one season might see an abundance of grazing herds and another the dominance of woody shrubs, Homo erectus could find a way to persist. Flexibility was not an optional trait, it was their core identity. Yet we must be cautious not to romanticize this. Flexibility came with costs. Generalists rarely dominate any one niche. They are not the fastest runners, the strongest chewers, or the most efficient climbers. Instead, their advantage lies in never being excluded from the game altogether. In a world that changed as rapidly and unpredictably as the Pleistocene landscapes of Africa and Asia, this may have been the only winning strategy. While their cousins clung to what had once worked, Homo erected a path built not on certainty but on adjustment. What makes this story humbling is that it shows how survival is often less about glory than compromise. The largest apes were impressive, the most robust jaws remarkable, yet it was the less specialised, more adaptable forms that endured. Between 2 and 1 million years ago, survival belonged to those who could bend rather than break, who could improvise rather than insist. That is the lesson the fossil record leaves us with. In a world that never stays the same, sometimes the most powerful adaptation is simply the to change. Flexibility, however, did not only shape diet and movement, it also influenced social organisation, though the traces of this are far more subtle. Groups that could adapt to shifting food supplies likely had to adjust their size and cooperation accordingly. In seasons of abundance, bands may have grown larger, sharing access to plentiful resources, while in leaner times they might have splintered into smaller units capable of surviving on scattered patches of food. This fluidity in group size mirrors the ecological flexibility visible in their tools and diets. Such elasticity is difficult to capture in the fossil record, yet patterns in site distribution hint at it. Some campsites are small and temporary, while others show repeated use, as if groups gathered when circumstances allowed and dispersed when conditions demanded. This dynamic would have created resilience, enabling communities to withstand environmental shocks that could have undone more rigidly structured species. The adaptability of Homo erectus also extended into mobility across landscapes with challenging barriers. To reach Southeast Asia or temperate regions of Eurasia, populations would have had to cross rivers, mountains, and shifting coastlines. Their persistence in such diverse settings suggests they were not deterred by these obstacles, but found ways to work around them, whether by timing migrations with seasonal lows in rivers or by exploiting coastal resources along the way. This kind of flexibility is not spectacular in the way massive jaws or towering size are, but it is arguably more powerful. It allowed them to treat the planet not as a series of impassable walls, but as a patchwork of opportunities. We can also see the imprint of generalism in their longevity. Homo erectus persisted for nearly 2 million years, longer than many specialized lineages of apes combined. To endure for such a span, through cycles of climate change and shifting habitats, required more than luck. It required a capacity to recalibrate with each new challenge. While forests disappeared in Europe and dietary specialists faltered in Africa, Homo erectus adjusted again and again. Their story is not one of triumph over others, but of persistence in a world that refused to stand still. If we strip the narrative down to its essence, what remains is a lesson in humility. Survival did not come from mastering one environment to perfection, but from never being so tied to one that change meant collapse. The great experiments of the Miocene apes show us what happens when species pour their futures into narrow adaptations. Homo erectus, by contrast, reveals the quiet strength of being good enough at many things rather than the best at only one. It is this middle path, less dramatic yet more enduring, that carved out space for their extraordinary tenure across continents. And so, when we ask why flexibility mattered more than strength, the answer lies not in spectacle, but in resilience. It was not the most specialized who won, nor the strongest, but those who could shift when the world demanded it. Between 2 and 1 million years ago, in the uncertain landscapes of Africa and beyond, generalists proved that sometimes survival is less about conquering and more about enduring with quiet versatility. Around 2 million years ago, Africa became a crowded stage. It was no longer the domain of one lineage alone, but a patchwork of overlapping species, each trying to solve the same problem: how to endure in landscapes that were becoming more unpredictable with each generation. In this shifting arena, Homo erectus was not the only contender. The smaller-bodied Homo habilis still lingered, clinging to survival through its long-favoured strategy of opportunism, while emerging forms we classify as Homo heidelbergensis began to appear, with stronger builds and new approaches to tool-making. To walk the plains of Africa in this age was to witness not a straight line of progress, but an arms race of ideas, diets, and survival strategies, each testing what it meant to be human before the word human had any meaning at all. Homo habilis, often called the handyman for the stone flakes associated with its remains, represents a lineage that had taken its first tentative steps into tool-assisted survival. These tools were simpler than the Acheulean hand axes of Homo erectus, often just sharp-edged fragments struck from a core, but they were effective for butchering carcasses and scraping hides. Fossils of habilis show a smaller body, with relatively long arms and curved fingers that hint at time still spent in trees. This was not a fully terrestrial ape, but one bridging worlds. Its advantage lay in opportunism, grabbing whatever resources were available, whether by scavenging from predators or exploiting patches of vegetation. But in open savannas, speed and endurance mattered, and habilis struggled to compete with erectus, whose longer legs and more efficient stride carried it further and faster in search of food. Homo erectus, in contrast, was already a traveller, pushing beyond Africa and thriving in multiple habitats. In the African record, erectus shows up with robust skeletons suited for long-distance walking, and with hand axes that could serve dozens of purposes. Where habilis chipped a stone into a single cutting edge, erectus shaped a tool into a durable multi-purpose instrument. Archaeological layers reveal that erectus often controlled access to large carcasses, their tools leaving marks across elephant bones and other megafauna. This suggests a capacity to coordinate hunts, or at least to dominate scavenging opportunities before others arrived. In sheer reach, both geographic and technological, erectus was beginning to eclipse its contemporaries. Then there is Homo heidelbergensis, appearing closer to 700,000 years ago, but with roots stretching earlier. Its fossils, with broad faces, large brains compared to erectus, and stocky frames, indicate a lineage adapting to colder and more variable climates. The tools associated with heidelbergensis show refinements beyond the Acheulean tradition, with prepared core techniques that allowed multiple sharp flakes to be struck from a single stone. This was not simply better toolmaking, it was planning. A napper had to visualize the shape within the stone and strike in a sequence, an intellectual leap that hinted at growing cognitive flexibility. The presence of wooden spears dating to around 400,000 years ago suggests that this lineage may have been among the first to weaponize hunting in a deliberate way. What unites these species is not harmony, but tension. They shared overlapping ranges and ecological niches, often pursuing similar prey and plant foods. The fossil record shows that during this period, Africa was not a continent where only one hominin thrived at a time. Instead, it was a mosaic of experiments, with species pressing against one another. The arms race was not about who had the sharpest teeth or the biggest jaw, but about whose strategies allowed them to endure the longest. Competition among them likely played out in countless subtle ways. Groups of habilis, less efficient on open ground, may have been pushed into marginal habitats where Erectus did not roam. Erectus, with its long legs and durable tools, may have claimed carcasses first, leaving little for smaller-bodied rivals. Heidelbergensis, with its refined tools and strong builds, may have exploited resources in harsher climates where Erectus was less comfortable. None of these interactions are visible in direct fossilized conflict. There are no clear signs of battles or deliberate extermination. Instead, the competition unfolded through survival odds tilted ever so slightly by body size, stride length, tool complexity, and social cooperation. What makes this period remarkable is that it demonstrates how survival was no longer a matter of one lineage solving the puzzle of a particular environment. It had become a contest of overlapping strategies, each probing different evolutionary paths. The very fact that multiple species coexisted for hundreds of thousands of years shows that there was no single, right way to be human-like. Each carried strengths and weaknesses. Each tested a solution. Yet the landscape could not sustain all of them indefinitely. From the perspective of deep time, we can see this period not as a straight march toward modern humanity, but as a branching thicket dense with possibilities. Some branches withered, others persisted, and still others gave rise to new experiments. Between 2 million and 500,000 years ago, Africa was not a cradle for one species, but a crowded arena where generalists, opportunists, and innovators struggled side by side. Their competition was not loud or dramatic, but inscribed quietly into the fossil record, into stone flakes and hand axes, into footprints pressed into mud. And though many of their names are forgotten, their struggles shaped the possibilities that followed, proving that even among close kin, survival is never guaranteed. If we could walk through this ancient Africa, what we would find is less a battlefield and more a patchwork of overlapping territories. At watering holes, bones of large herbivores bear both the cut marks of simple flakes and the deeper slices of Achillean hand axes, suggesting that multiple hominin species sometimes shared the same carcass, though not likely at the same moment. One group may have scavenged in the morning, another later in the day, each exploiting opportunities with the tools at hand. This paints a picture not of dramatic clashes, but of subtle displacements, where timing and efficiency determined which lineage got the lion's share and which survived on scraps. Homo habilis, with its smaller stature, may have been nimble and resourceful in navigating river valleys and wooded patches. Homo erectus, by contrast, was increasingly tied to the open plains, where endurance and cooperation counted for more. The rise of Homo heidelbergensis brought another shift. A hominin capable of handling larger prey through thrusting spears and coordinated hunts, suggesting a growing confidence in tackling animals that earlier species may have approached only after death. Each of these groups left their signature in the archaeological record, not in written accounts, but in stone, wood, and bone, silent evidence of overlapping strategies playing out on the same landscapes. Climate oscillations added further stress to this mosaic. Between 2 million and 500,000 years ago, the African environment swung between wetter and drier phases, driving shifts in vegetation and animal populations. In wetter times, forests expanded, offering refuge to smaller-bodied habilis. In drier intervals, savannas dominated, favouring the endurance walkers of Erectus. Heidelbergensis seems to have been particularly adept at surviving in variable conditions, adjusting to both wooded and open settings. These alternating cycles may have kept the arms race alive, as no single lineage could hold an advantage across all conditions. Instead, each gained temporary footholds, only to lose them again as climates swung back. Yet it was not just external pressures that defined the contest. Internal biology mattered as well. Homo erectus had larger body sizes, demanding more calories, but also enabling greater physical resilience. Homo habilis required less energy, but its smaller groups and limited range may have restricted its capacity to weather leaner times. Homo heidelbergensis, with its larger brain and more complex tools, could likely plan ahead more effectively, but such brains also demanded higher metabolic costs. Survival was always a balancing act, with each species carrying its own trade-offs between energy intake, reproduction, and social dynamics. What lingers in this period is the sense of possibility. For over 1 million years, Africa held not one but several human-like species, each carving a place in a volatile world. Their coexistence reminds us that evolution does not favour inevitabilities, but experiments. If climates had shifted differently, if resources had been more abundant or less variable, perhaps habilis would have lingered longer, or erectus might have remained unrivalled, or heidelbergensis could have become the dominant form across the continent. Instead, all we see today are the traces of their efforts, stone edges dulled by time, bones etched with cut marks, and skulls that whisper of paths taken and paths closed. Their overlapping lives show us that survival was never simple, never singular, but always a contest of possibilities in a world that asked too much of them all. Between 800,000 and 500,000 years ago, the planet entered a phase of extreme unpredictability. It was a time when Earth's climate system shifted gears, abandoning the gentler patterns of earlier ice ages for a new rhythm of brutal glacial and interglacial swings. These were not subtle shifts. They were profound reorganizations of the world's environments, bringing sweeping changes to rainfall, vegetation, coastlines, and animal populations within spans of time that mattered deeply to the lives of hominins. To live through these cycles was to face an evolutionary lottery, where each roll of the dice determined who would endure and who would vanish. The record of these swings is etched in ocean sediments and ice cores, where oxygen isotopes trace the waxing and waning of massive ice sheets. Before this time, glacial cycles tended to occur every 40,000 years, driven largely by changes in Earth's tilt. Around 800,000 years ago, the tempo shifted. Glacial periods became longer and harsher, lasting up to 100,000 years, with shorter, more intense warm interludes in between. The causes of this mid-Pleistocene transition remain debated, but its effects on living things were unmistakable. Environments flipped back and forth like a switch, sometimes within a handful of generations, forcing hominins and animals alike to adapt quickly or risk extinction. On the ground in Africa, these climatic roulette spins translated into dramatic shifts in landscapes. Lakes appeared and disappeared, sometimes within a few thousand years. Grasslands spread widely in colder, drier intervals, only to contract again when wetter interglacials returned forests to regions that had been open savannas. For species tied too closely to one kind of habitat, these oscillations spelled trouble. The robust Australopiths, already locked into a narrow dietary strategy, could not easily keep pace with such swings. By contrast, lineages with broader tolerances, like Homo erectus and later Homo heidelbergensis, had the flexibility to adjust, moving when necessary, diversifying their diets, and inventing new tools that extended their survival options. These climatic shifts also acted as crucibles for innovation. In colder, drier intervals, hunting large game may have become more crucial as plant resources dwindled. Archaeological evidence shows that by 500,000 years ago, hominins were fashioning wooden spears capable of thrusting into prey, an unmistakable sign of coordinated hunting strategies. Such technologies were not luxuries. They were survival requirements in landscapes where easy plant foods could vanish within a season. Fire use may also have become more consistent in this era, not only for warmth in chillier climates, but for processing a wider variety of foods. In this sense, the roulette of climate did not merely filter species, it pushed surviving lineages to sharpen their ingenuity. The toll of these swings can be seen in the dwindling diversity of hominins. Where once Africa had hosted multiple species side by side, the harsh filters of climate began to thin the ranks. Fossils suggest that by 500,000 years ago, the older forms such as Homo habilis and Paranthropus were gone. What endured were the more adaptable lineages, capable of bridging both lush and arid settings. The world was not selecting for the strongest or even the most specialised. It was selecting for the flexible, the ones who could pivot as habitats flipped and who could carry knowledge across changing landscapes. It is humbling to realise how much survival depended on forces far beyond the control of these ancient beings. A lake's disappearance, a shift in rainfall belts, or the spread of ice sheets half a world away could cascade into the loss of entire populations. Yet what stands out in this period is not despair, but persistence. Again and again, some hominins managed to adjust, enduring drought, frost and shifting coastlines, carrying forward not by dominance but by adaptability. This was not an age of certainty but of resilience, and those who lived through it became the ancestors of everything that followed. What makes this era even more striking is the speed at which conditions could flip. For many animals, changes in vegetation and rainfall that occurred over just a few thousand years were enough to disrupt migration routes or collapse breeding grounds. For hominins, such rapid shifts were not background noise. They were daily challenges that shaped the arc of their lives. Imagine a valley that, within the span of several generations, transformed from a lush basin filled with hippos, fish and papyrus reeds into a dry grassland where dust storms scoured the ground, and only herds of grazing antelope could endure. A group that had once relied on lakeshore resources suddenly had to hunt in open plains or move on entirely. The fossil and archaeological record tells us that some did just that. Survival was not about waiting for the climate to stabilise, but about staying mobile, staying inventive, and staying open to whatever the landscape offered next. This constant roulette also forced hominins to broaden their range. Sites scattered across East and South Africa suggest repeated pulses of dispersal, with populations moving into new regions when old ones became uninhabitable. These movements may have fragmented groups, isolating them for long stretches, then reuniting them when conditions improved. Genetic diversity would have ebbed and flowed with these cycles, potentially shaping evolutionary trajectories in ways we can only begin to piece together. Unlike their more forest-bound cousins of the past, these hominins were no longer tethered to one biome. The very instability of their world became the engine of their adaptability. Tools from this period also hint at growing foresight. Acheulean hand axes continue to dominate, but we find them in increasing abundance and across wider landscapes, suggesting that stoneworking knowledge was being passed along more consistently. At sites where multiple layers of occupation accumulate, we see hominins returning again and again, reusing locations strategically. This implies memory of places and perhaps even traditions tied to particular landscapes. In a world where the dice of climate were constantly rolling, knowledge of where to find water, where to hunt, and where to gather stone became as crucial as the tools themselves. It is worth pausing here to reflect on how little was guaranteed. The Earth was not offering a stable cradle for life, but an ever-shifting puzzle that forced hominins to gamble with their own existence. Every drought, every glacial advance, every shrinking forest was another test. Most species failed these tests, leaving only faint traces in the fossil record, but a few found ways to bend without breaking, to adjust without vanishing. Between 800 and 500,000 years ago, the planet was not kind, yet out of its volatility came the shaping of beings who could endure instability itself. Their survival was not inevitable. It was earned again and again with each turn of the climate wheel. Around 700,000 years ago, Europe was not yet the heartland of glacial mammoths, painted caves, or enduring human presence. It was instead a testing ground, a continent where hominin lineages arrived, clung to survival for a time, and sometimes disappeared again. The evidence we have is fragmentary, fragile like the populations themselves, but enough to sketch a picture of Europe as a place of experiments in adaptation. It was not always welcoming. Icy winters swept across its northern latitudes, and even its temperate zones could swing violently with each glacial-interglacial cycle. Yet into this volatile land came species that would shape the continent's evolutionary trajectory, Homo antecessor and Homo heidelbergensis. Their remains remind us that survival in Europe was always precarious, and that being first did not guarantee being last. Homo antecessor is known primarily from the site of Atapuerca in northern Spain, where bones dating to roughly 800 to 700,000 years ago reveal a tall, modern-looking body shape combined with archaic features of the skull. The fossil record is sparse, but the significance is considerable. Here we see one of the earliest clear presences of hominins in Western Europe, pushing the timeline of settlement back into a period when glaciers frequently advanced from the north. Their tools, simple flakes and cores, suggest competence but not the refinement seen in later populations. The mere fact that antecessor lived at this latitude tells us something about endurance. To inhabit Europe at this time required not only the capacity to hunt and gather, but to cope with bitter winters and sudden ecological swings. Their presence is a reminder that hominin dispersal was not limited to warm refuges, but extended into marginal lands where survival was anything but assured. Homo heidelbergensis, appearing later around 600,000 years ago, presents a different story. Found in sites stretching from Germany to Greece, this species was more robust, with large brow ridges, broad faces and brain sizes approaching or exceeding 1,000 cubic centimetres. Their tools show refinement beyond earlier Acheulean hand axes, with evidence of prepared core techniques that allowed more efficient flake production. At sites like Schöningen in Germany, wooden spears dating to around 400,000 years ago suggest organised hunting of large game, possibly horses. This was no longer scavenging or opportunistic but targeted pursuit. The coordination implied by such activities points to a social fabric strong enough to withstand the stresses of Europe's volatile climates. And yet, both of these European species show the fragility of early hominin settlement. Fossil records are thin, scattered across caves and river deposits, indicating that populations were never very large. Genetic evidence from later descendants hints at repeated bottlenecks, times when groups dwindled to precarious numbers. Europe was a harsh filter, pruning back those who could not withstand the deep freezes of glacial phases or the abrupt floods of interglacials. Unlike Africa, where vast expanses allowed populations to shift with climate belts, Europe's fragmented geography of mountains, rivers and coastlines meant that isolation was common. Small groups could be cut off for generations, surviving only if they carried enough numbers and resilience to last through long winters. What is remarkable is that they managed it all. To walk into Europe 700,000 years ago was to gamble against extinction. Food was less predictable, winters harsher, and predators abundant. Lions, bears, and saber-toothed cats prowled the same valleys where hominins tried to hunt. And yet Homo antecessor left its mark, however briefly, and Homo heidelbergensis endured long enough to become a key player in shaping later lineages. Their stories tell us that Europe was not simply colonized once, but contested repeatedly, each attempt testing how far adaptation could stretch before snapping. The picture that emerges is not one of triumph but of tenuous footholds. Europe almost kept these species, almost made them permanent inhabitants, but the record shows how easily populations could blink out under pressure, leaving only traces in sediments and bones. Their survival was not inevitable, and their disappearance not sudden, but a drawn-out negotiation with climates that refused to stabilise. As far as we can tell, Europe in this period was a continent of near misses, experiments in endurance that remind us how thin the margin of survival could be. The archaeological record also suggests that Europe's hominins were constantly negotiating with the landscape itself. In southern regions, caves became recurring shelters, not merely temporary hideouts, but places returned to across multiple generations. Layers of stone tools, animal bones, and ash suggest a pattern of seasonal occupation, a rhythm tied to migrations of herds or the availability of water. In northern latitudes, however, survival meant enduring conditions that no cave alone could soften. There, evidence of shelters constructed from wood and bone hints at the beginnings of a technological response to climate. These makeshift dwellings were not permanent houses, but they demonstrate ingenuity in buffering against freezing winds and snow. Even if they vanished with the spring thaw, they show that hominins were experimenting with ways of holding ground in regions where nature offered little comfort. The prey they pursued also tells us about their strategies. Horse bones at Schöningen show cut marks and patterns of butchery, consistent with systematic hunting, not chance encounters. Red deer, bison, and even rhinoceros appear in assemblages from Central Europe, pointing to hominins who were willing to take risks against formidable animals. This was dangerous work, and it almost certainly required planning, cooperation, and perhaps even division of roles within groups. To hunt such prey without projectiles like bows or atlatls meant closing distance with thrusting spears, a task that demanded courage and coordination. The fact that these hunts succeeded often enough to leave archaeological traces suggests that Homo heidelbergensis groups had already developed the kind of social resilience needed to face both predators and prey larger than themselves. Still, these accomplishments do not mask the precariousness of their presence. Population density was likely low, and groups may have been widely scattered across Europe's valleys and plains. Each band would have lived with the constant possibility of local extinction, whether from disease, starvation, or harsh winters. Fossil evidence is sparse in part because many such groups likely disappeared without leaving lasting traces. For every site we uncover, there may have been dozens of groups that rose and fell in obscurity. Survival in Europe was less about expansion and more about endurance in small, fragile enclaves. If we take the long view, what Europe reveals in this window of time is the way human evolution unfolded not just as a story of invention, but as a story of persistence at the edges of habitability. The continent was less a stable home than a proving ground, a place where hominins could demonstrate ingenuity, toughness, and cooperation, yet where each advance came with the risk of collapse. The fact that Europe kept some lineages for hundreds of thousands of years before they were replaced by others shows that survival here was always conditional, always under review by the relentless forces of climate and geography. It reminds us that the road toward becoming enduring inhabitants of Europe was neither direct nor guaranteed, but paved with fragile experiments whose outcomes we are only just beginning to reconstruct. Asia between 700,000 and 200,000 years ago was vast, diverse, and unpredictable. From the frozen steppes of Siberia to the humid forests of Southeast Asia, from the deserts of Central Asia to the high-altitude plateaus of Tibet, it was a continent of extremes. It is in this setting that one of the most elusive hominin lineages left its faint but unmistakable traces. We call them Denisovans, though the name is modern, borrowed from a single cave in the Altai mountains of Siberia, where a fragment of finger bone was first recovered in the early years of this century. From such a modest piece of evidence, and from a handful of teeth and skeletal fragments, a whole branch of humanity has been pieced together, not by what we see with our eyes, but by what we can read from ancient DNA. The Denisovan story is a reminder of how much we do not know. Unlike Homo erectus or Homo heidelbergensis, whose bones and tools lie scattered across layers of earth, Denisovans remain ghosts, inferred more from genomes than from fossils. The Denisova cave, high in the Altai, has yielded a few tantalizing remains: a large molar with unusual features, a finger bone from a young girl, and fragments of long bones ground down by time. From these, geneticists have reconstructed an entire population distinct from any other known hominin. The DNA reveals that Denisovans were not a minor offshoot, but a widespread group that ranged across Asia for hundreds of thousands of years. Their story lies not in abundant skeletons, but in the molecular signatures they left behind. What makes them even more remarkable is evidence of adaptation to environments that challenge even modern physiology. A genetic variant first identified in people living on the Tibetan plateau, which enables survival at extreme altitudes with low oxygen levels, appears to have been inherited from Denisovans. This suggests that far from being confined to caves, they roamed landscapes that demanded extraordinary resilience. Imagine small groups moving across icy valleys, breathing thin air at elevations where most mammals struggle, yet carving out a living in places that would have been inaccessible to others. These hints tell us that Denisovans were not merely shadows in the genetic record, but active participants in Asia's ecological dramas, surviving in habitats that tested the limits of human endurance. The scattered genetic evidence also implies that Denisovans were not a single uniform population, but perhaps a network of related groups spread from Siberia to Southeast Asia. Distinct genetic signatures suggest regional variation, as though Denisovans had radiated outward and then adapted locally to different conditions. In one region, they may have hunted in cold boreal forests. In another, they may have foraged in tropical environments. This breadth of adaptation echoes the generalist strategies of Homo erectus, but with unique local refinements. If Erectus had blazed the initial path across Asia, Denisovans may represent one of the lineages that followed, experimenting with ways of surviving in regions previously unoccupied. And yet their physical appearance remains largely a mystery. The fossils are too few, the bones too fragmented to reconstruct a clear image. Was their build stocky to conserve heat in cold regions? Did they share the robust jaws and skull shapes of other Middle Pleistocene hominins, or did they diverge in ways we have yet to glimpse? At present we cannot say. All we have are genetic breadcrumbs and a handful of teeth that hint at large body size and unusual morphology. The frustration for science is palpable. A lineage spread across a continent, yet glimpsed only through scraps. Still, even those scraps force us to confront the possibility that Asia was not a marginal stage for hominins, but one of their richest theatres. What Denisovans reveal is that human evolution was not a neat sequence, but a branching forest. Between 700,000 and 200,000 years ago, Asia hosted experiments in survival that we are only beginning to decipher. Some groups ventured into high plateaus, others into frozen valleys, still others into lush tropics. The Denisovans' genetic legacy proves that they endured long enough, and widely enough, to leave their imprint across much of Asia's human history. They stand as outsiders only in the sense that their bones are rare. In reality, they were insiders in their own time, adapted, enduring, and spread far across a continent of extremes. The Denisovan trail also forces us to rethink what counts as presence. For most hominins, we measure their existence by stone tools, hearths, or bones preserved in caves. Denisovans, however, push us into the realm of indirect traces. Sediment samples from Denisova Cave have yielded microscopic fragments of DNA, even when no bones are visible to the eye. These genetic residues, shed by skin cells or bodily fluids, tell us that Denisovans occupied the cave repeatedly over long spans of time. In effect, the soil itself becomes a witness, preserving the echoes of lives lived tens or even hundreds of thousands of years ago. This method has revealed that Denisovans returned to the cave through multiple climatic cycles, surviving both colder and warmer periods, proof that they were not transient visitors, but long-term inhabitants of the region. What is equally striking is how their presence aligns with the broader faunal record of Asia. Fossils of cold-adapted animals such as woolly rhinos and steppe bison sit alongside Denisovan traces in the Altai, suggesting that they thrived in steppe and tundra landscapes as much as in forests. If we step further south, the genetic hints in modern populations suggest that Denisovans also endured in more tropical settings. Such breadth indicates not a fragile, isolated group, but a resilient lineage, capable of shifting across radically different ecosystems. Their ability to adapt to both thin mountain air and dense tropical humidity hints at physiological plasticity we can only begin to imagine. Still, their material culture remains elusive. Unlike Homo heidelbergensis or Homo erectus, Denisovans have not left us a clear technological fingerprint. It is possible that they used tools similar to those of other Middle Pleistocene populations, but the absence of distinctive artifacts makes it difficult to pin technologies to their name. Some researchers argue that stone assemblages in Siberia or Tibet may be theirs, but without direct association to bones or DNA, the link is tentative. This ambiguity reminds us how easily a major branch of humanity can slip through the cracks of archaeology, leaving behind only whispers in the genetic code. Yet those whispers have weight. The evidence shows that Denisovans were not minor footnotes but key players in Asia for hundreds of thousands of years. Their ability to withstand high altitudes, their spread across vast regions, and their persistence through harsh climatic cycles all point to a lineage that succeeded where others might have failed. And though the fossil record remains stingy, each new discovery, whether a tooth, a bone chip, or a few strands of DNA, reshapes our picture of what Asia once was. Not empty space between other lineages, but a continent full of its own enduring experiments in what it meant to be human. Between 600 and 300,000 years ago, Africa was a continent in flux. But unlike Europe's icy corridors or Asia's fragmented landscapes, it offered a strange paradox: volatility mixed with opportunity. Rainfall patterns shifted back and forth, lakes swelled and dried, and savannas expanded only to contract again. Yet within this constant reshuffling lay an ecological canvas broad enough to sustain a variety of hominin experiments. Fossils from this window remind us that Africa was not a single cradle of humanity, but a workshop with many benches, each occupied by different hands carving their own survival strategies. Some of these species were close cousins of ours, others more distant, yet all played their part in shaping the trajectory that eventually led to beings who could ask the very questions we're exploring tonight. The diversity of African hominins in this period is striking. Sites such as Bodo in Ethiopia, Kabwe in Zambia, and Jebel Irhoud in Morocco yield skulls that defy simple categorization. Some show traits associated with older lineages, massive brow ridges, projecting faces, thick cranial bones, while others reveal hints of what we recognize as more modern, rounder brain cases, reduced jaws, finer features. Rather than a single smooth transition, the fossil record suggests a patchwork of populations, some experimenting with one set of anatomical solutions, others with another. It is tempting to imagine Africa as a vast evolutionary crucible, where the pressures of climate and environment kept reshaping hominin bodies and minds, forging resilience in the face of relentless change. Ecological flexibility was central to survival here. The African continent at this time was a mosaic of grasslands, wetlands and woodland belts, each expanding or contracting as glacial pulses shifted rainfall belts. Hominins who survived were those who could move between these settings, exploiting rivers when fish were plentiful, turning to grassland hunting when herds surged, and retreating to forest margins when drier conditions prevailed. Unlike the narrower specialists that once thrived in more stable settings, these hominins carried with them an ability to pivot quickly, drawing on a wider menu of foods and habitats. Stone tools of this era, especially from Middle Stone Age industries, reflect this growing adaptability. At sites like Olorgesailie in Kenya and Florisbad in South Africa, toolkits became more varied, shifting from the large, heavy hand axes of earlier Acheulean traditions to points, scrapers, and flakes designed for multiple tasks. Such versatility mirrors the ecological challenges of the time. When environments changed abruptly, hominins needed implements that could serve different purposes: cutting meat, shaping wood, scraping hides, or piercing plants. The shift in technology suggests not only innovation, but also transmission of knowledge across groups, as these new strategies spread widely across the continent. What is humbling is that even within this crucible of innovation and diversity, survival was far from guaranteed. Populations likely rose and fell with climate cycles, some leaving only a skull or a jaw to mark their brief presence. Yet the overall picture is one of persistence, of lineages testing themselves again and again against the unpredictability of Africa's landscapes. Out of this constant filtering process emerge populations increasingly equipped to cope with instability itself, an advantage that would prove decisive in the long run. The record from 600 to 300,000 years ago therefore reminds us that Africa's role was not to produce one inevitable species, but to maintain the conditions in which multiple hominins could thrive, adapt, and fail in turn. It was this continual churning of diversity, rather than stability, that made the continent the last safe workshop of humanity. To look at these fossils is to see a reminder that we are not the result of a single path, but of a crucible that tested many, discarded some, and refined others. Another window into this African crucible comes from the sites that capture moments of transition, not in anatomy alone but in behaviour. At Olorgesailie, for example, excavations have revealed not only shifting stone tool styles, but also the transport of raw materials across long distances. Obsidian flakes found there often came from sources more than 20 kilometres away, suggesting that hominins were beginning to plan movements with an eye toward resource availability, rather than relying only on what lay at hand. This kind of foresight implies more complex cognitive mapping of landscapes, as groups tracked not only animals and plants, but also stone outcrops, weaving these into survival strategies across generations. Water sources also played a central role in shaping the fortunes of hominins in this period. Africa's Great Lakes waxed and waned with the rhythms of glacial cycles, sometimes swelling to vast inland seas, at other times shrinking to salty puddles or vanishing altogether. Archaeological horizons often appear in pulses aligned with these wet-dry shifts, as groups clustered along shorelines when water was abundant and dispersed when drought tightened its grip. The fossilised remains of fish, hippos and crocodiles found alongside stone tools underscore how deeply aquatic resources were integrated into hominin diets. Far from being strictly hunters of land game, these populations displayed remarkable versatility in drawing sustenance from whatever habitats rose and fell around them. In southern Africa, sites like Florisbad and Border Cave add further texture to this story. Fossils here show cranial forms that mix archaic and modern traits, reflecting the broader theme of mosaic evolution. These finds remind us that Africa was not moving in lockstep toward one final outcome, but experimenting across regions with different combinations of features. Each population was a local response to immediate challenges, whether in drier savannas, wooded uplands, or coastal zones. When viewed together, they sketch a continent buzzing with variation rather than converging on a single model of humanity. Equally revealing are the hints of symbolic or proto-symbolic behaviour emerging during this time frame. Pieces of ochre with scrape marks and objects possibly used as pigments suggest that some groups may have been experimenting with colour long before it became common practice. While we cannot claim certainty about what these materials meant, the repeated presence of such objects implies that cognition was stretching beyond the purely practical. Even if such gestures were fleeting or local, they point to minds already probing new dimensions of expression within the African crucible. Taken together, these strands of evidence portray Africa as both a refuge and a forge. Its shifting climates did not crush hominins into extinction, but forced them into flexibility, producing a patchwork of species and behaviours that fed into one another over millennia. By 600 to 300,000 years ago, the continent had become less a stable homeland than a dynamic workshop, one that did not guarantee survival, but that offered enough space and variety for some lineages to weather change while others vanished into silence. Between 300,000 and 100,000 years ago, the Earth was not home to a single lineage of humans, but a crowded cast of species, each experimenting with survival in its own way. To picture this world is to set aside the modern illusion of being alone and instead imagine landscapes filled with overlapping presences. In Europe, stocky hunters with heavy brows. In Asia, elusive populations adapted to extremes of cold and altitude. In Africa, anatomically modern forms still sharing space with older cousins. In Southeast Asia, tiny-bodied toolmakers living on isolated islands. At least 7 distinct kinds of humans are known from this span, and there may have been more whose bones remain hidden in caves yet to be explored. It was a world of diversity not just in animals and climates, but in the very forms of humanity itself. The fossil record from Africa shows populations that we recognise as early Homo sapiens taking shape around 300,000 years ago, with finds at Jebel Irhoud in Morocco revealing a blend of modern facial traits and archaic skull shapes. These were not yet us in every detail, but their presence signals a shift toward the anatomy that defines our species. At the same time, other African sites preserve individuals with more archaic features, suggesting that the continent still hosted multiple hominin populations. Africa was not the birthplace of one species alone, but the meeting ground of several, living in proximity, sometimes interacting, and often adapting to the same unpredictable climates. Across Europe, Homo heidelbergensis gave way to the beings we call Neanderthals, who by 250,000 years ago were firmly established with their own distinct anatomy and culture. They mastered hunting in cold environments, left traces of shelters, and fashioned tools with a sophistication that rivaled or surpassed those of contemporaneous humans elsewhere. In Siberia and Tibet, Denisovans held their ground, their genetic legacy whispering of populations scattered across the breadth of Asia. They are shadows in the archaeological record, but real participants in the story of this crowded world, adapted to conditions that would have tested any lineage's endurance. Further south, new surprises appeared. On the Indonesian island of Flores, fossils reveal Homo floresiensis, a diminutive species standing barely a metre tall, yet crafting stone tools and hunting small animals. Their existence, stretching well into this time frame, demonstrates that human evolution was not a simple march toward larger brains and bodies, but a kaleidoscope of possibilities shaped by local pressures. Even more astonishing, in the caves of South Africa, Homo naledi left remains that date to within the last 300,000 years. With small brains but complex behaviours, including the possible deliberate placement of their dead, they stand as a stark reminder that intelligence and culture do not follow a single predictable path. What emerges from this panorama is not a linear story, but a crowded one. Between 300,000 and 100,000 years ago, the Earth was more a patchwork of human species than a stage set for the inevitable rise of one. These groups were not simply evolutionary dead ends, but active agents shaping their own destinies. Each carried distinct adaptations, some to ice, some to forests, some to mountains, some to islands. Each also carried vulnerabilities. What united them was the challenge of surviving in a world that kept shifting its terms: climate instability, changing prey populations, and competition not only with animals but sometimes with one another. We do not yet know how often these different humans encountered each other, whether their relationships were hostile, indifferent, or cooperative. What we do know is that they overlapped in time, and in some regions, in space. To imagine a savanna where multiple lineages roamed, or a mountain valley where strangers might have crossed paths, is to glimpse a world where humanity was not singular but plural. It was a crowded Earth, filled with variations of ourselves, each writing a chapter in a story that was still very much unfinished. The archaeological layers from this period reveal not only the presence of these many species, but also the richness of their adaptations. In Europe and Western Asia, stone tool traditions diversified, with prepared core technologies like the Levallois method spreading widely. This technique allowed toolmakers to shape flakes with more predictable forms, increasing efficiency and versatility. It was not confined to one lineage. Evidence suggests that multiple human groups, from Africa to Europe to Asia, converged on similar technological solutions, perhaps independently. Such parallel developments underline how different populations, though separated by geography and anatomy, were responding to shared challenges with comparable ingenuity. In tropical Asia, cave sites preserve evidence of small-bodied hominins occupying islands for astonishing lengths of time. On Flores, Homo floresiensis continued to make stone tools and exploit island resources long after larger-bodied relatives had vanished from other regions. The persistence of such an insular lineage highlights the role of isolation in preserving diversity. On a remote island, far from the pressures of continental competition, evolution produced a distinct experiment in what it meant to be human, one that endured in parallel with much larger and more technologically sophisticated species elsewhere. Africa during this same window continued to be a hotbed of variation. Fossil skulls such as those from Florisbad or Homo show a mixture of archaic and modern features, testifying to the coexistence of multiple lineages or subpopulations across the continent. The variability was not just in anatomy but in lifeways. Some groups thrived in wooded zones, others in savannas, and still others along coasts and lakeshores. Each ecological setting demanded its own blend of skills, tools, and diets. To call Africa the crucible of humanity is accurate, but it was not a crucible forging one outcome. It was a continent where many outcomes were being tested simultaneously. Perhaps most humbling is Homo naledi's persistence into this time frame. With cranial capacities closer to those of Australopiths than to contemporary humans, yet with behaviours suggesting deliberate deposition of the dead deep within caves, they confound expectations about what small-brained hominins were capable of. Their survival in South Africa as recently as 300,000 years ago shows that intelligence and culture cannot be measured by brain size alone. They stand as evidence that the human story was not just one of linear progress, but of coexistence among forms that defy simple classification. Taken as a whole, the period between 300,000 and 100,000 years ago was one of maximum diversity in the human lineage. At least 7 species shared the planet, each with unique adaptations and challenges. It was a time when the Earth held many versions of us, none aware of being part of a larger pattern, each simply enduring as best they could. This crowded world reminds us that the singular humanity we take for granted today is the exception, not the rule. For most of prehistory, being human meant living alongside others who were human in different ways, shaping a landscape of plurality that has only recently faded into memory. Around 100,000 years ago, the Earth was a patchwork of climates, some regions locked in icy cold, others warmer and more forgiving, but in nearly all corners survival demanded a delicate balance between physiology, ingenuity, and luck. In this landscape, different human lineages still coexisted, and their futures hinged on small advantages that played out over generations. It was not always about who had the biggest brain or the strongest body. Sometimes survival depended on subtler edges, tiny tools, clever habits, or social structures that multiplied resilience when conditions grew harsh. One of these advantages lay in clothing. Archaeological traces of bone needles from around this period suggest that some populations were able to stitch together hides into garments far more protective than simple draped furs. A stitched seam could keep out wind and trap heat around the body, extending the range of habitable environments into colder regions. While these needles are silent artifacts, their implications are vast. A child wrapped in sewn clothing rather than loose hide had a higher chance of surviving a long winter. A mother carrying an infant could keep her baby warmer, and that baby's survival meant the group grew. Small edges in technology had disproportionate effects on survival rates, and over centuries such effects reshaped entire populations. Traps may have been another quiet innovation. Evidence of the early snares or pitfall hunting is difficult to find, yet hints exist in wear marks on tools and in the remains of animals that seem to have been captured en masse rather than individually. A well-set trap was a force multiplier. It allowed groups to secure calories while expending less energy and less risk than direct pursuit. Compared to chasing game with spears, a line of snares along a game trail offered safer, more predictable returns. These subtle methods reduced the dangers of hunting and freed time for other tasks, further boosting group survival. Population size itself was also a decisive factor. Groups with higher fertility and faster reproduction rates had more children, which meant more hands to gather food, more defenders in times of war conflict, and a larger pool of knowledge to share. Archaeological patterns suggest that some populations formed denser, more interconnected networks, while others remained scattered and thin. The dense networks were better at weathering crises. When drought hit one valley, kinship or trading partners in the next valley could provide aid. Knowledge of where herds migrated or which plants could be stored for lean times spread more quickly in larger networks, creating a kind of collective resilience no single family could maintain alone. Even physiology may have played a role. Caloric efficiency, the ability to thrive on fewer calories while still reproducing, meant certain groups could sustain larger numbers even when resources were scarce. In a sense, survival was not just about acquiring more food, but about needing less to begin with. Over time, these differences in reproductive pace and energy demands tilted the balance between lineages. One group might disappear slowly, not through catastrophic collapse, but by steadily losing the numbers game to neighbours who reproduced more quickly and endured on less. The evidence for these small advantages is fragmentary and often indirect, but the cumulative picture is compelling. Between 100,000 and 60,000 years ago, human history was being shaped not only by dramatic hunts or grand migrations, but by the unglamorous details of daily survival. A sharper needle, a better placed trap, a slightly warmer coat, or an extra child surviving past infancy. Each was a small victory. Yet together they added up to survival on an evolutionary scale. What is striking is how invisible these edges might have been at the time. No hunter would have boasted that a trapline would one day tilt the fate of species. No mother sewing hides by firelight could have known her careful stitches secured the future. But in the end, it was these quiet and practical advantages, layered generation after generation, that gave certain human lineages the edge to endure, while others gradually slipped from the world. The more closely we look at this stretch of deep time between 100,000 and 60,000 years ago, the clearer it becomes that survival was not determined by a single leap forward, but by an accumulation of modest but crucial refinements. Take food processing, for example. Evidence from microscopic wear on stone tools suggests that groups were experimenting with ways to make tough plants edible, grinding roots or pounding fibrous tubers into digestible forms. What might look to us like little more than broken rocks were in fact instruments that turned otherwise indigestible matter into calories. This mattered greatly in environments where game was unreliable. Being able to survive on fallback foods, not just preferred ones, was another quiet but vital edge. Cooking too may have provided a subtle advantage during this period. Charred plant remains and burned bone fragments point to the increasing use of controlled fire not merely for warmth or protection, but for preparing meals. Cooked food delivers more energy with less digestive effort, and it also reduces pathogens. A diet that was both safer and more energy-rich meant stronger bodies and healthier children. Over generations, these incremental health advantages rippled outward into larger population stability and resilience. Mobility was another factor shaping success. Some groups were capable of moving across long distances with remarkable adaptability, adjusting to new habitats as climates shifted. Mobility was not only about legs carrying bodies, but about memory, mapping, and the social ability to transmit that knowledge. Oral traditions, stories of where rivers ran, when herds migrated, where flint could be found, were as much survival tools as spears. Populations that carried such shared maps in their minds could push into new territories, escaping famine in one area and exploiting abundance in another. By contrast, groups with limited ranges found themselves trapped when local environments failed. We should also consider cooperation itself. Archaeological evidence of communal butchery sites, with multiple individuals working on large animal carcasses, hints at coordinated hunting strategies that went beyond opportunistic kills. Success in taking down a large animal like a horse or an aurochs required not just strength but careful planning and trust within a group. Division of labour, some individuals driving animals, others ambushing, others processing meat, turned cooperation into calories at a scale no solitary hunter could achieve. More food from fewer risks meant healthier, more numerous families, and more numerous families meant resilience when disaster struck. The way groups cared for their vulnerable members may also have been decisive. Fossil remains of individuals who lived long despite serious injury or disability suggest that some populations invested in social care. Supporting those who could not directly contribute may have seemed costly in the short term, but in practice it built stronger bonds and ensured that knowledge carriers, elders, toolmakers, storytellers, lived long enough to pass down skills and traditions. In evolutionary terms, compassion itself may have been a survival advantage, reinforcing the networks that made groups more cohesive and more resilient under stress. We cannot ignore the role of chance. Some populations likely found themselves in ecological sweet spots where food and water remained reliable even during harsh swings of climate. Geography shielded them while others faltered. But when chance offered opportunity, those with small advantages were more likely to seize it. A group with durable clothing could push a little further into a cold steppe. A group with grinding stones could linger in drier lands where tubers remained the only reliable food. These were not dramatic leaps, but steady nudges that accumulated over time into decisive differences. When we try to reconstruct this period, it is tempting to look for a single trait that made survival possible. But the record shows a mosaic of strategies. Strength mattered, yes, but strength without adaptability could not last. Intelligence mattered, but intelligence without cooperation or patience left groups fragile. It was the blending of small edges, technological tweaks, cooperative practices, subtle physiological efficiencies and cultural habits that together built a survival machine. Each refinement was like a thread woven into a larger fabric, and it was the fabric, not the individual threads, that endured. So when we ask whether survival in this period was about brains, bodies, or something subtler, the answer is that it was never only one. It was the quiet accumulation of edges, many invisible in the moment, that tilted the balance. To those living then, these were simply practical solutions to daily problems. How to keep warm, how to catch food, how to keep a child alive another winter. Yet in the long run, these practical solutions were the difference between vanishing into the fossil record and leaving descendants who still walk the earth today. Between 50,000 and 30,000 years ago, the world was still home to a surprising variety of humans, each lineage having carved out its own fragile foothold in the shifting landscapes of the Pleistocene. On islands, in caves, across highlands and valleys, several species lived parallel lives, distinct yet overlapping, sometimes separated by vast oceans, sometimes by only a few valleys. Yet in the span of just a few tens of millennia, nearly all of them would vanish, leaving only one branch of the tree to remain. The story of their disappearance is not one of sudden catastrophe, but rather of attrition, of climate tightening its grip, of habitats collapsing, and of populations too small or too isolated to withstand the squeeze. It is also a story of encounters, where different human lineages brushed up against one another and where the balance of survival tipped, slowly but decisively. Take the tiny humans of Flores, Homo floresiensis. Discovered in the early 2000s and nicknamed the Hobbits, they stood barely a metre tall and lived on an island in Indonesia until perhaps 50,000 years ago. Their bones show a unique blend of traits, some archaic and others surprisingly modern, and their survival in isolation speaks to the extraordinary adaptability of humans as a family. But islands can be both refuge and trap. Flores preserved them for hundreds of thousands of years, shielded from the pressures of the wider world. But when sea levels shifted and new arrivals found their way to the island, the delicate balance fractured. A small island population can be resilient in stable times, but it is acutely vulnerable when conditions change. Once outside pressures arrived, whether climate shifts reducing resources or competition from incoming humans, the survival of such a small-bodied, low-density species became impossible. In southern Africa, the discovery of Homo naledi adds another layer of mystery. With anatomy that blended primitive traits with features closer to modern humans, they appear to have persisted until at least 230,000 years ago, and perhaps later. Some researchers argue their survival might even have overlapped with the timeline we are speaking of here. The fact that such a lineage endured so late is remarkable. Yet endurance does not mean invincibility. A species with limited distribution, occupying caves and adapted to very specific environments, may persist under stable conditions but falter quickly under pressure. As climates swung more violently during the later Pleistocene, their narrow ecological range may have simply left them nowhere to go. Unlike more mobile, generalist species, they were tethered to particular niches. Once those niches collapsed, so too did their chance of survival. And then, of course, there were the Neanderthals. Unlike Floresiensis or Naledi, the Neanderthals were not a marginal species clinging to survival in a corner of the world. For hundreds of thousands of years they dominated Europe and parts of Western Asia. Their bodies were built for cold climates, their toolkits sophisticated, their ability to hunt large animals undeniable. Yet by 30,000 years ago they too were gone. The explanation does not lie in a single cause but in a convergence of pressures. Climate played a role, as it always does. The late Pleistocene was a time of harsh oscillations, with rapid cold spells turning forests into steppe and then back again. For populations already small and scattered, these swings magnified vulnerability. Each climatic downturn fragmented habitats, forcing groups into shrinking refuges where isolation deepened. But climate alone does not explain the timing. The pattern suggests something more: competition. When populations with overlapping needs share the same landscapes, the principle of competitive exclusion holds that one will eventually outlast the other. In some valleys, Neanderthals and other humans may have coexisted for centuries. Yet survival is not about centuries, but about the slow accumulation of edges, slightly faster reproduction, broader diets, larger social networks. In the long run, even small differences can compound. Neanderthals, with high calorie needs and lower population density, may have simply been outpaced. It does not diminish their sophistication to recognize that in a world of changing environments, their particular adaptations left them more vulnerable. The vanishings between 50,000 and 30,000 years ago remind us of how precarious survival always is. Homo floresiensis, Homo naledi, Neanderthals, each had endured for extraordinary spans of time. Each was successful in its context. Yet when conditions shifted, when climates grew harsher and competitors arrived, their survival strategies no longer matched the world they lived in. Extinction does not erase their achievements, but it does remind us that success in one age does not guarantee survival in the next. So why did our cousins fade one by one? Perhaps because the Earth itself kept asking new questions, and not all lineages had answers that worked in time. Their absence is not simply a void in the fossil record, but a reminder of how narrow the path of endurance can be. We walk it still. The silence left by these disappearances is difficult to grasp. When we imagine the world of 40,000 years ago, it is tempting to picture our own species alone against the Ice Age backdrop. But that was not the case. Valleys echoed with many kinds of human voices. The vanishing of one group after another thinned that chorus, not all at once, but gradually, until only a single voice remained. What is striking is how localized some of these losses appear. Neanderthals, for instance, did not vanish from all of Europe in a single sweep. Their presence lingers longer in pockets of the Iberian Peninsula than in Central Europe. This staggered retreat hints at a process of fragmentation, each community holding out as long as conditions allowed, before the combined stress of resource scarcity and shrinking population size pushed them beyond recovery. On islands like Flores, extinction might have come faster, though the archaeological record there remains sparse. Isolation gave floresiensis its long survival, but once a disruption came, whether environmental or through the arrival of outsiders, its small population size meant recovery was nearly impossible. A drought that a larger, more widespread species could endure might have spelled disaster for them. Small island populations are always vulnerable to such tipping points, and we see the same pattern across the natural world even today. The uniqueness of floresiensis was both its strength and its weakness. Extraordinary survival in a singular setting, but no buffer against change. The case of Homo naledi remains one of the most enigmatic. Here was a lineage with traits so unusual that its persistence into relatively recent times forces us to reconsider the neatness of our evolutionary story. Their survival into a period of increasing competition suggests that even highly localized or seemingly primitive lineages could endure in specific refuges. But such endurance was likely fragile. Once their preferred habitats changed, there was little chance of adaptation on the scale needed to face a harsher, more dynamic world. Naledi's story reminds us that extinction does not always mean failure. Sometimes it simply means being locked into a way of life that the Earth no longer supports. All of these vanishings, taken together, illustrate that extinction is rarely a sudden, singular event. It is more often the slow erosion of numbers, the narrowing of habitat, and the compounding of disadvantages until recovery is no longer possible. By 30,000 years ago, what had once been a crowded world of human variety had thinned to near silence. And yet the traces of these lost branches remain, not only in fossils but in the landscapes they once shaped, the tools they left behind, and the possibility that for tens of thousands of years the story of being human was never ours alone. Their disappearance does not diminish their place in history. It sharpens it, reminding us that survival is never inevitable, and that our own existence today rests on the narrowest of margins. Around 30,000 years ago, the stage of human evolution looked very different than it does today. For millions of years, the Earth had been home to a shifting mosaic of ape species, from the giant leaf-eaters of Asia to the tool-using hominins of Africa and Europe. But by this point, most of those branches had already been cut short. The forests that once rang with the calls of dozens of primate lineages had quieted. What remained were only a handful of survivors. In our own genus, all others had gone, leaving just us. And beyond our species, the family of great apes itself, once a riot of diversity during the Miocene, had dwindled to a fragile remnant. Today, only 8 species of great ape endure on the planet: chimpanzees, bonobos, 2 species of gorilla and 3 species of orangutan, alongside us the final representatives of what was once a far larger family. This reduction is one of the more sobering patterns in the fossil record. When we look back 20 million years, apes were among the most widespread and varied mammals on Earth, filling niches in Europe, Asia, and Africa. Yet by the time our species stood alone as the last human lineage, our cousins had already retreated into shrinking pockets. Chimpanzees and bonobos persisted in the forests of Central Africa. Gorillas found their stronghold in mountain and lowland refuges. Orangutans held on in the tangled rainforests of Southeast Asia. They survived not because they were destined to, but because their bodies and behaviours matched very particular habitats that remained relatively stable. The disappearance of other apes, whether in Anatolia, Europe, or parts of Asia, was not inevitable until their ecological space dissolved. What we are left with is a snapshot of survivors, not the full chorus that once was. Each of these surviving apes carries a deep evolutionary history written into their bones. Gorillas, with their massive jaws and digestive systems tuned for fibrous plants, reflect an ancestry that adapted to thick forests where fruit was not always abundant. Chimpanzees, with their mix of hunting, tool use, and highly social behaviour, mirror a lineage that survived by flexibility, living in woodlands and forests that demanded a varied diet and coordinated group life. Orangutans, in contrast, embody arboreal mastery, their long arms and solitary habits suited to life high in the canopy, where fruits ripen unpredictably. Bonobos, closely related to chimpanzees but distinct in social structure, show how even subtle behavioural differences can define a lineage's survival path. None of these strategies are universal. Each is a careful match between body, behaviour and environment. What is remarkable is not only their survival, but their persistence alongside us. For tens of thousands of years, our ancestors walked the same landscapes as gorillas and chimpanzees and voyaged into regions not far from orangutan strongholds. In earlier times, other ape lineages vanished when competitors arrived, as seen in the extinctions of Europe during the Miocene. Yet here, at least for now, coexistence has held. Perhaps this is because the ranges of these surviving apes were in ecological zones that humans did not initially prize: dense forests, difficult mountains, marginal lands that offered less to early foragers than open grasslands or fertile valleys. It was geography as much as biology that allowed them to persist. By the present day, we stand as the most numerous great ape in history, our populations numbering in the billions spread across every continent. Yet that very scale throws into sharper relief the fragility of our cousins. From nearly 100 ape species that thrived in the Miocene to only 8 now, the long arc of ape history is one of contraction. Survival has always been a narrow path, and chance as much as adaptation determines who continues. The fact that gorillas, chimpanzees, orangutans and bonobos still live among us is not a foregone conclusion of evolution, but the outcome of countless contingencies. If the story of the last 30,000 years teaches us anything, it is that survival in the ape family is never guaranteed. We are the last ape standing in the human lineage, but not the only great apes alive. We share the present with the fragile remnants of a family that once filled the earth, and their continued presence reminds us that what endures today is not always what endures tomorrow. The chorus of ape voices that once spanned the world is reduced to a quartet of distant relatives. And us. Why they, and not others, survived is a question still being pieced together. What we know is that the story of our survival cannot be told without them, for in their lives we glimpse echoes of the ancient experiments that shaped the fate of all apes. When we trace the path that led to this narrowing, it is not only the sheer number of extinctions that stands out, but the pattern of what survived. The apes that remain are in many ways specialists, yet each represents a slightly different solution to the puzzle of survival. Chimpanzees and bonobos hold onto a highly flexible diet, but rely on large, cohesive social groups that buffer individuals against scarcity. Gorillas, despite their massive size and specific plant-heavy diet, have adapted by organising themselves into smaller family units led by dominant silverbacks, ensuring stability in territories that are often difficult to penetrate. Orangutans, meanwhile, demonstrate the opposite survival strategy. Near solitude, moving deliberately through vast stretches of canopy and minimising conflict by dispersing widely. These different strategies reveal that there was never a single way to endure. Each lineage found a distinct route through the bottleneck of environmental change, and each of those routes just happened, for now, to remain open. Their distribution today also carries the imprint of deep time. The forests of Central Africa, where chimpanzees and bonobos thrive, were once much broader and more continuous. As climate cycles waxed and waned, these forests contracted and expanded like a breathing lung, isolating populations for thousands of years at a time before rejoining them. This ebb and flow left traces not only in the DNA of these species, but in the subtle differences in their behaviours. A chimpanzee troop in West Africa may use stones to crack nuts, while one in East Africa might strip sticks to fish termites from mounds. These are not genetic differences, but cultural habits, learned behaviours passed down through generations. In this way, even within the survivors, we see the shadow of the broader diversity that once characterised all apes. Orangutans, by contrast, are confined to the islands of Borneo and Sumatra. Their ancestors roamed far more widely across Asia, but as forests retreated, their ranges contracted to isolated refugees. Today's orangutans are the product of those long contractions, and their survival owes much to their ability to stretch out the resources of a sparse fruiting forest, to endure long stretches of scarcity, and to rely on memory of when and where food will appear again. It is not simply strength or size that explains why orangutans endured, but an extraordinary patience written into their life history. The story of the gorillas illustrates another facet of survival. Their bodies are massive, their daily intake of vegetation enormous, yet they persist in mountainous or lowland forests that are difficult to access. In a sense, their stronghold is not only ecological but geographical. They live in places where the broader forces of human expansion came later, where the terrain itself acted as a shield. Here too chance played its part, just as it did for chimpanzees, bonobos and orangutans. Taken together, these 8 great apes, 7 non-human, 1 human, are not a carefully curated set of survivors, but the remnants of a once flourishing dynasty. Each lineage survived for reasons that can be partially explained by ecology, anatomy and geography, but also by historical accidents. We often look back at the lost apes of the Miocene and wonder why only a fraction remain. The answer may be simpler than we think. Survival is rarely a story of inevitability. It is often the outcome of narrow margins, timely adaptations, and the luck of being in the right place when the Earth shifted its conditions once more. Looking back over tens of millions of years, it is easy to forget that our own survival was never guaranteed. We belong to a family tree that once branched exuberantly, with apes in the forests of Europe, Asia and Africa, some immense in size, others delicate and small. That chorus of diversity has been cut down again and again by climate, by geography, and by sheer chance. By 30,000 years ago, every other human lineage was gone, and only a few non-human cousins endured in shrinking refuges. The question that lingers is not why they disappeared, but why we did not. Was there something in our nature that set us apart, or was it simply the luck of being in the right place at the right time? The evidence suggests both. Our anatomy was not extraordinary on its own. We were not the fastest, nor the strongest, nor the most specialised, but we were flexible, able to thrive in deserts, forests, grasslands and coastlines. Unlike the gorillas, whose massive frames tied them to fibrous vegetation, or the orangutans, whose long arms tethered them to the canopy, we had no single dependence. We could eat many foods, shift our diets as landscapes changed, and spread into new habitats when old ones failed. This generalism was less glamorous than the striking adaptations of our cousins, but it proved more durable. Connection also mattered. Populations that could share knowledge and resources stood a better chance of surviving the unpredictable swings of the Ice Age. Oral memory of where water could be found, or when a herd might pass, became as valuable as any tool. Unlike smaller, more isolated lineages, our groups remained knitted together by exchange and story. This web of interconnection cushioned us when environments collapsed and allowed us to rebound where others dwindled. Chance, however, should not be underestimated. A few thousand years of drought or a volcanic eruption in the wrong place could easily have cut short our story, just as similar pressures did for many other species. That this did not happen is not evidence of inevitability but of contingency. Our survival sits atop a mountain of vanished possibilities, other apes that might have flourished, other humans that might have endured. We are not the inevitable outcome of evolution, but one of its many experiments, the one that happened to remain when others fell away. The fact that we are the last ape standing is as much a burden as it is a curiosity. It reminds us that our family's history is one of fragility, not permanence. 99% of all species that have ever lived are gone, and our ancestors lived through near misses countless times. We exist today not because extinction was avoidable, but because for now it has not yet claimed us. So was our survival luck, or something in our nature? The truth lies somewhere in between. Adaptability, generalism, interconnection, and cooperation gave us tools to face an unstable planet. But without favourable moments of chance, we might have vanished as quietly as Oreopithecus in Europe, or Homo floresiensis on Flores. Our story is not one of triumph over inevitability, but of endurance amid uncertainty. And perhaps that is what it means to be human, not to be guaranteed, but to persist for a time on the narrow edge where life and extinction meet. When we frame ourselves as the survivors, It is tempting to imagine a straight line of progress leading toward the present. But survival rarely follows straight lines. It bends, stumbles, and often doubles back. The fossil record shows that many traits we carry today were not sudden breakthroughs, but gradual assemblages of older features. Walking upright, shaping stone, taming fire, all appeared slowly, layered over deep time. None of them guaranteed permanence. Other species walked upright too. Other species shaped stone. Other species knew fire, yet we endured while they slipped into memory. The difference may not lie in a single invention or trait, but in how our ancestors stitched many small strategies together into a flexible whole. That flexibility extended beyond tools into social life. A lone human in the Pleistocene would not have survived long, but networks of humans could. Cohesion within groups, and the ability to connect those groups across distance, meant ideas and resources moved further than any single individual could. This capacity to share, food in lean times, knowledge of where to find shelter, the memory of a safe waterhole, wove a safety net that caught us again and again. Many lineages had the spark of intelligence or the strength to endure hardship, but without those webs of connection, they faced their challenges alone. We faced ours together. Even so, we must not mistake survival for mastery. For most of our history, we were few in number and scattered, our populations fragile and vulnerable to the slightest environmental swing. A failed harvest, a harsh winter, or an epidemic could have erased us from the ledger of life. That it did not was not proof of inevitability, but of resilience in the face of odds. Every new generation carried forward the precarious thread of existence, sometimes with luck, sometimes with ingenuity, but always on the knife edge between continuity and collapse. It is humbling to realize that our presence today is not the outcome of destiny, but of persistence. We are the inheritors of a legacy of near misses, a chain of unlikely survivals that stretched across millions of years. If one storm had been stronger, if one drought had lasted longer, if one small population had failed to find refuge, we might not be here to tell the story at all. The fact that we are means that when asked why we did not go extinct, we must answer with caution. It was not because we were destined to remain, nor because we were the best fitted in any ultimate sense. It was because our blend of adaptability, cooperation, and sheer contingency allowed us to walk the narrowing path of survival a little longer than the rest. Thank you, fellow Sapiens, for wandering this timeline with me, for drifting into deep time, for slowing down and remembering. If this helped you fall asleep, helped you study, or simply helped you step out of the noise for a while, thank you for being here. If you think more people should know this story, you know what to do. Like, subscribe, share it with the Sapiens in your life, and tell me, are you listening before bed, while working, or somewhere in the world I can only imagine? And as always, stay curious, stay calm. I'll see you in the next story.